Welcome back to day 2 of the CLC Winter Bootcamp, everyone. We are happy to be here, and we hope you are too.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming back.
Good to see you all.
Yeah, this should be a fun day.
Still arranged in the picture from least bracelets to most bracelets.
We actually have somebody in the chat who denied me of another bracelet.
Really?
Denise.
Yeah.
Denise Pratt. Yes, she won a bracelet, and I got second.
Well, that's solid. All right, today we are going over the championship blueprint. We're going to help you with building massive stacks. ICM simplified, it's way overcomplicated the way it is, and crushing big field MTTs, which, there's not really anything like going deep in a main event, even from a big 1600 to, obviously the 10K main.
It's the best.
Yeah, and I think something to emphasize while looking at all of this is the cohesiveness of these three concepts. They all work together pretty seamlessly, and it's important to understand all of them to understand any one of them individually.
Yep, no doubt. So building massive stacks and bagging the chip lead, one of the really important aspects of it is table presence. And I'm sure that some people watching this see me and Alex and are like, do I have to stare at people? No, like Chrissy has a fantastic table presence as well and doesn't, And so there's ways to have a really good table presence that fits you as who you are.
Yeah, I definitely think, and when we say table presence, I think this is something that is often confused by a lot of people. And it's not like you need to be intimidating or super scary or not talk to anyone or hyper stoic or any of these things. I think a lot of your table presence is actually something that you generate from your level of confidence within yourself. And this comes from work you do away from the table and being comfortable in your own skin, which ties into some of the things we talked about yesterday in terms of being healthy and being in shape. Like having this presence at the table comes from confidence in yourself and a comfort level with the situation. So this is your mindset, your diet, your studying, all of these things kind of manifest into your table presence. And whether or not you're, whether you're more materialistic, and I don't mean like you like designer handbags or something like that. I mean, as in your understanding of the world is rooted in physical reality, or you're a little bit more in tune with energy. I think table presence is something that everyone can feel, and it's kind of undeniable that this exists at some point. Some people sit down at the table and you're just like, okay, like this person's ready to go. They're here to play.
Yeah, they're battling.
Yeah, they're not.
Yeah, I was going to say, this goes right back to confidence, as you said. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, it's okay. And I'm just saying that I think that all of these things are energetic, and I don't want to neglect these. I think there's the materialistic side of poker, which is the theory, treating your body well, all of these things. But then there's also the more energetic aspects that rooted in confidence and your perception of yourself. So bring the best version of yourself to the table, ready to go, and other people will notice, and they'll actually be a lot less likely to mess with you, believe it or not.
Yeah, I think all of those small details of that make a difference of, when somebody sits down at the table and they give off the, whether you want to say it's energetic or that there's actually, things you could point to, but you're like, I'm going to run this person over. They're not fighting for every hand. They're happy to, the way they fold their hand, you could tell they're just looking for a reason to fold, versus, maybe somebody's a little bit hesitant in folding in spots. And, even that actually really deters, I think, certain actions. And like, as you said, being targeted or attacked, like just the feeling of, showing that you're not going to snap fold in spots.
It makes people sit with those uncomfortable feelings when they're bluffing just a little bit longer. And they're like, I don't want to go through that again, do I?
Exactly. And it's tiring for a lot of people. And then a lot of people just want to pull their phone back out and go into phone land. So, I can't stress this enough. I think it's so important.
Yeah. And building massive stacks, doesn't come, so I'm moving on to aggressive image here. Yeah. Doesn't come from stealing a third of someone's stack and shoving the river and having them fold and doing that over and over and over until you have 3 or 4 starting stacks early on in the tournament. That's not how it works. It comes from jab, 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 occasional hooks, and building that aggressive image and then getting paid.
Yeah.
It's definitely The aggressive image, so much of what we need to understand about theory is that we're designing a lot of our bluffs around the intention of getting our value bets called. And I think that's why if you struggle to build stacks, one of your main problems is that you're not aggressive enough. And I don't mean that you're not betting enough with your value hands or something like that. Your consistent aggression is probably lacking. Yeah. And therefore it allows your opponent to feel comfortable folding to you when they have a good hand. And also just comfortable playing against you in general. I think being aggressive makes people uncomfortable. It makes them make bad decisions, and it allows us to bring people to an area of the game tree that we are more comfortable than they are. And that's going to be one of the keys to success, especially in big field main events, is making people play from a position of discomfort and uncertainty while we're playing from a position of dominance and certainty and
comfort.
And comfort, yeah. And having this aggressive image, it's not, like Chance said, it's not about the pots you steal. It's more about the fact that, when you cooler someone, they can't make that hero fold because they've seen you, c-bet and double barrel and all these things. And this also works not just in the sense of for getting them to pay you when you have value hands, but it also kind of makes people deny their own equity. I can't tell you the amount of times that I've been at a table and bet the flop and have some guy in the tank, or bet the turn and some guys in the tank, and he folds and will literally say to me out loud, I knew you were barreling every river, or I knew you were always betting again on the turn. So I fold the flop, so I fold the turn. When in reality, I was probably done after I bet the turn. And I'm like, if this guy calls the turn, he's not folding the river. And he just confirmed that for me by saying oh, I wasn't prepared to call the river, so I folded the turn. And
they have the fear of future aggression, and so they fold an earlier street.
Yeah, so we're just denying equity over and over and over again, and then forcing them to make mistakes when they have the hands that they think are too good to fold.
Yeah, so much of it is a perception thing. And I think a lot of people are, let's just say they end up showing a bluff once or twice, and then they feel really uncomfortable to bluff the third or fourth time. And to almost embrace that image of having the perception that you are overly aggressive, and to see that it's really going to be a benefit to you when, you get to control the future hands that are happening. And as you said, you don't want to be that person that people are not happy to get queens or kings in pre-flop versus you. That's not a good spot to be.
I couldn't agree more. One of the most common tournament pain points that I hear all the time is that I can always get up to 3 or 4 starting stacks, but then I get a little deeper and I just kind of fizzle out around the money, whether it's in the money, outside the money, whatever. Yeah. And the reason that is because you're probably good at playing your hands reasonably well, getting paid from players that don't know what's going on. And then once those players are gone and you're playing with players that have a half decent awareness, they realize that you've only shown the goods for 6 hours.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get paid later on without the aggressive image.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the reality is that you don't get enough good hands to win a tournament just by good hands. Maybe that'll happen a couple times in your life, but I can assure you that none of us have won tournaments where we're just always having good hands. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, that'd be much easier. But the reality is you don't get good hands frequently enough to win a tournament on that alone.
Yeah, and there's certain spots in poker where the three of us or an experienced pro would see them and be like, this is just a clear spot to bluff, a clear spot to double barrel, a clear spot to bet when the player checks back, maybe some check raises, right? And so when you find those bluff spots, it kind of compounds. And you'll notice this is a common theme from day one, where when you find the bluff spots, you get the aggressive image, and then you optimize value betting.
Yeah, they work hand in hand, and it's not necessarily piecemeal where it looks like, all right, I got to find the bluffs and find the value bet. They work together, and I think this is a common question or confusion point that a lot of people have, is that well, I'm struggling to find enough bluffs, or I don't know when to value bet the right size, and recognizing that they operate on some level of a continuum where spots that our bluffs or our value bet spots lead to our bluffs. We have a look-alike principle where our value betting and our bluffing should look similar as a general rule. Of course, we're going to make these adjustments like we discussed yesterday, as far as okay, maybe our opponent's overfolding to C-bets. and they're not necessarily aware of our pattern in bet sizing. So we can bet bigger with our value hands and smaller with our bluffs. So there are spots to tweak this, but as a general rule, we're looking to reflect, like for our bluff spots and our value bet spots, to be kind of like a mirror of each other.
Yeah. Cool.
So that brings us to the hammer versus the nail. The hammer forces mistakes through aggression, punishes opponents for having imbalances, and adjusts strategy based on table dynamics. You know, when we're playing tournaments, cash, whatever form of poker, we want to be the hammer. You know, we want to be able to find spots to be aggressive and have our opponent make a bad fold or a bad call.
Yeah, make your opponents being in the aggressive stance while your opponents are defensive is almost always going to yield better results. Most people are very uncomfortable dealing with aggression. They don't get it. Like I said a minute ago, you don't get enough good hands to just wait for good hands to play the aggressive opponent. And most people, when they see this aggression, their thought is like, all right, that guy's aggressive. I'm going to wait until I get something, and then I'm going to catch him. And they get, you know, and both of them laugh because it's funny. That is not how you deal with aggression at all. That is the last way. If you're sitting at my table, and I'll tell you this, if you're sitting there waiting to get your aces to 3-bet me, like, I'll bet you a lot that time when you finally get aces and you 3-bet, you're going to take 2 big blinds of mine that I just raised to, and that's going to be it. Especially
or you call with the 8-4 suited like yesterday. Flop 2 pair.
I'm very good at flopping 2 pair. But so forcing these mistakes through the aggression, it works 2 ways. It makes people overfold for one, but then it also actually creates a level of, like, you know, submissiveness from your opponents where they're waiting for that moment. And in all of that time that they've been waiting, you've accumulated 3 big blinds here, 5 big blinds here, 10 big blinds there, and all of a sudden you're up 100 big blinds. They wait, they finally get their big hand. Maybe they get 5 big blinds from you, maybe they get 10, maybe they get 20, but maybe they get 100, but still you're just going to be hammering away at them, chiseling at their stack, and they'll get their chunks here and there. But when there's any kind of a cooler confrontation, you're generally going to be winning more on the good side of it, losing less on the bad side of it, because your opponent isn't fighting back enough, so therefore they don't have enough bluff. So keeping this aggression will actually prevent a lot of people from fighting back, which is somewhat counterintuitive. And when you think about it logically, it doesn't really make sense. If someone's really aggressive in poker, that means that they're exposing themselves a little bit more. And I saw a question in the chat say about how do we deal with aggressive opponents, and one of the answers to that is to just understand that they're going to have worse hands on average. Like that's really important to understand, and it's something that and therefore we need to be comfortable responding to them with more aggression, or with at least with calling with a wider range of hands, which is uncomfortable for a lot of players. So this is why understanding the game tree and understanding how to navigate post flop is such an important prerequisite for finding appropriate aggression. Because if you are trying to raise hands more and more frequently pre-flop, well, you're going to find yourself in more marginal, uncomfortable spots post-flop. So being comfortable in navigating that when others aren't is going to see your chip stack gradually increase instead of bleed away.
Yeah, and I have a lot to add to that as well, but I'm going to kind of keep us moving.
Cool.
2 and 3 really blend together for me. Punishing opponents for having imbalances and adjust our strategy based on table dynamics, because there's some players at the table where I'm so excited to run them over. And then some players at the table where I'm like, I just have to make top pair against this player. You know, and so being aware of which player you want to execute each strategy, your opponents won't necessarily differentiate. They'll just see someone who's playing a lot of hands, 3-betting a lot, being aggressive. They're not going to realize it's against this one specific opponent or these multiple at the table.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. Your perception, the way that people perceive you is going to be determined by your average of your actions. So not necessarily differentiated by your actions against individual players. So that, like Chance alluded to, there will be some players where I know it's going to be really hard to bluff them. So I'm just going to be water. I'm going to not bluff them because I know they're not going to fold. But then there are other players at the table who will be really easy to bluff. So I'm going to be really aggressive against them. And when you understand this, they don't get to see inside your head. So all they see is that you're regularly aggressive. So even the opponent that maybe you're, I don't want to say avoiding, but you're not going for all of these bluffs, you're not c-betting as frequently against them, they're going to see all your high c-bet frequency and your high raise frequency and all of these other regular aggressive tendencies against other players and assume that that's just what you're doing every time and be unable to like, you know, differentiate between what player is in this hand. It's like a different version of yourself is kind of how you want to see it.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to add that you guys didn't quite touch upon is, like, especially in these large field events that are multi-day tournaments that you get to play with people over and over potentially, there's a lot of game time as compared to like a turbo tournament. And I think that just how far it goes when you're that aggressive player, you're the hammer, that people don't want to raise your big blind. People don't want to get in pots with you. And that literally prints deep in these tournaments. And that's how you're building a stack. That's how you're not blinding away. Because even if it's just the small spots that maybe the button makes the tight fold and you get to win that hand. And maybe, so people are afraid to win to raise your big blind or to play pots with you, or people are afraid to defend their big blind versus you because they think you're such a hammer that they want to, use premium hands to start, defending with pre-flop. So they're adjusting really poorly. And as everybody knows, it's so hard to play against these players. So this is the real key, is how do we be that person at the table?
Yeah. If you never get bluffed, you win a lot. If nobody tries to bluff you, you're going to crush.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be realizing all your equity and they're not. So being someone who people are afraid to play against because of your regular aggression, because of your willingness to battle, it tires people out and they'll just defer and be like, you know what? I can't handle this every single hand. I can't go every street and have to be thinking through all of these difficult spots. And they often will just be like, I'm just going to play tight against this guy. And then you've won.
Yeah.
Next up, what you do not want to be, the nail. They play tight solid. They try to memorize pre-flop charts and solver outputs and just kind of emulate what they see instead of actually think their way through the decisions. They slowly bleed away chips before busting. And that's kind of the biggest one that resonates with me is you see them, they sit there, they play, they make good folds, and then they lose a flip because they don't have any chips they haven't accumulated.
Yeah, I think it's another one of those things. This idea of being the nail, slowly bleeding away chips. This is going to be the same person that tells you that the only reason they didn't win the tournament is because they can't win their flips. They can't win their all-ins. And while that may be true, everyone eventually loses all-ins. The question is, do you have chips? Do you have more chips behind or not when it happens? And does your chip stack gradually increase or does it gradually decrease? The flips, they'll come and go. You'll win some, you'll lose some. But what we want to do, what we need to focus on is our decision making in the other hands. You get ace king and someone has queens and you have 30 big blinds effectively. Everyone's just getting all in this spot, and whoever wins, that's not something we can control. But what we can control is all those little hands, all those little C bets, all those check raises that we find, all of those steal spots that we find. And then all of a sudden, maybe we have 40 big blinds instead of 30 because we picked up a bunch of small pots. So now when we lose that 20 big blind flip, instead of having 10 big blinds left, we have 20. And now we don't need to open jam the ace nine off from the cutoff. Instead, we raise and fold to the big blind who shoved with pocket jacks or whatever. So the cascading, kind of ripple effect of being someone who gradually accumulates chips instead of gradually loses chips will be very significant in your ability to survive in a tournament.
Yeah. And I think to the point of memorizing preflop charts, solver outputs, being afraid of making mistakes. This is the person who, they have a great 3-bet spot. Maybe someone, you can, for whatever reason, you think this guy's really wide or weak, and you don't take it because you don't have the right combo of hands. Or maybe you think someone's bluffing you on the river, but you don't have a good call combo. So you fold. And it's like, you need to be willing to, step outside the box, so to speak. Otherwise, it's like you're just hoping for dream scenarios to happen to get chips.
Yeah, and I remember like a hand I played where I 3-bet a guy and I was playing pretty ridiculous early in a tournament, which sometimes I do. And the player thought forever and folded, and I was like, they said, if I just had a pip better.
Yeah.
And it was like, I'm playing utterly out of control. Like you should be 6 pips wider.
Yeah.
Like people aren't making those adjustments to who they're playing against. Like that's the definition of a nail is like, well, I'm not allowed to 4-bet shove this. And it's like, well, actually you can do whatever you want. Second of all, if you were to have changed the solve to adjust to what my 3-betting frequencies were, then you would have shoved, but you don't.
Yeah. It's like some of these spots you can 4-bet range because your opponent is 3-betting 25%. And they're just folding too frequently for it to not be profitable to 4-bet.
Yeah, and then this kind of makes me think of the concept of, playing tight, playing solid, that's no mistake poker, and people being afraid to, look stupid or take an aggressive line.
When they say I played perfect.
Because that might be punting. And the thing that you have to realize is if you're overfolding and you're way too tight, you're actually punting in a different way, right? Like you're just literally bleeding out chips. You're never going to win a tournament. And you have to see that as a mistake the same way that the guy who just, 4-bet jammed ace-5 suited and maybe you weren't willing to do that, that could look like a mistake when he gets called and runs into aces, right?
Yeah, but if we were to use the football analogy, like kneeling 3 plays or 4 plays and turning the ball over is not that different from punting. So if you're bleeding away every single hand you play and not actually trying to accumulate, because if you're passing on a plus EV spot, well, you're losing EV by folding.
Yeah,
but people just don't call it a punt.
We can lose EV just as easily by overfolding as we can by playing overly aggressive. And as a matter of fact, you're going to have a much higher chance of winning by being too aggressive than too passive. The way
we all know these players, by the way. It's like if you've immediately when you say that, I can think of Brian Altman, Steven Song, you guys. It's like that these players are really difficult to play against, and look at their results. It's
because the common denominator is just putting people in regularly uncomfortable spots, consistent aggression. It's like the tide hitting the rocks. They're just going to erode it eventually over time. The rock has no chance of surviving in the long run with the water pounding against it constantly.
Yeah, and when we fold, it's so easy. Nobody sees the cards. You don't have to report the hand history to your friends necessarily. So I think a lot of people just end up making really tight folds over and over again and passing on all these opportunities.
Yeah, and think about the situation where you raise under the gun with ace king. Big blind defends, and it's a nails big blind. It comes like ace 10-4. I get check raised, and I have ace king, and I'm like,
yuck.
Oh, shit. Like, I guess I have ace king. I'm going to call, and then they bet the turn. I'm like, all right, just take it. You're in it. But then, like, I raise Boxing's big blind. It comes ace 10-4, and I have ace king, and he check raises, and I'm like, all right, let's put in some more money.
Yeah.
Turn comes, I'm never folding, and then the river comes, and I'm like, all right, now I'll start seeing what I think his bluff combos and his river combos are. So if you take a hammer in that situation, they're always getting called on the turn, and they're sometimes getting full stacks on the river. And you take a nail in that situation, and people start hero folding the turn.
Yeah.
Like it's just such a significant difference in value that you're getting if you're the hammer versus the nail, if you have that aggressive image.
Yeah.
If you're fighting for pots.
I feel like the majority of players fall into this category when we're talking about, the average 1K, 500,
I would say over 95% of players.
Yeah. So this is who you're playing against for the most part, I would say. And even if it doesn't feel that way, because I think people see day one, the first 5 levels of a tournament, and you don't see this as much in players, but it really comes out once reg closes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm assuming a lot of people relate to that, right? They're willing to play more pots and VPIP more early in the tournament, and then they're in the money, or reg is closed, then all of a sudden they think that becoming the nail is the way to go.
Yeah. And this is such a great way of thinking about it from Ryan is, are there any tight passive elite crushers? Nope. Not a one.
Yeah.
And before we move on, I want to hit on number 5, because I think that, and Chrissy touched on this before very, very well. But I really want to emphasize that mistakes are reflexive. If you're overfolding because your opponent, if your opponent isn't bluffing too much, you need to call more. If your opponent is not bluffing enough, you need to fold more. So mistakes they're not finite in terms of their they're always being the way that they are. It's a response to your opponent. Everything is dependent on how your opponent perceives and responds to the situation, not how it should be or how it is in theory.
Yeah, definitely. So metagame matters a ton in poker. First up, player types. Different player types create stylistic matchups and table dynamics that require adjustments to our baseline strategy. So you sit down in a tournament, and I'll give you an example of what mine is. I sit down level 1 of a 1600 all the way up to a 10K, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to raise a lot of pots. I'm going to 3-bet a lot versus late position. I'm going to play, this hammer style. And sometimes it works really well, and sometimes you realize that people just aren't having it, and I need to play a slightly more value-oriented game against them. But going in, my baseline isn't necessarily what a GTO strategy looks like. In fact, I'm way too wide in like a ton of different spots, probably too tight in some other ones, but I have a baseline strategy of what I am comfortable bringing to the table when I start, and then based on the player types and how we match up, I'm going to make my adjustments and deviations from that.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of in line with what I was just saying. But we need to be water, and this is we want to tend towards aggression because of the fact only that our opponents tend towards passivity. That's the only reason that we tend towards aggression. It's not because it's cool. It's not because we have fun bluffing people. It's because I think that's the mistake that most people make, is folding too much. Yeah. If we're at a table where that's no longer the mistake, then we want to be a lot tighter and play a lot less hands. Raising more pre-flop is not always the answer. It's only the answer if we have an edge post-flop, if our opponents are overfolding. And these factors are really important to be objective about when you're looking at it. So and this is, again, an example of take problems to their extremes. I'm going to keep saying this over and over, and I think it will help a lot of people when they're approaching these situations. Okay, if our opponents are always calling every single 3-bet, like we kind of discussed this example yesterday, well, we don't want a 3-bet bluff anymore. If our opponents are always calling the flop, always calling the turn, well, we could just tighten our bluffs and make our range more value oriented, and that's where the EV is coming from this opponent. Yeah. So this reflexivity of our strategy in response to theirs is going to be the key.
Yeah, and this is why you can't ever approach poker with, I have one game plan and I'm sticking to it. You always have to, be water, as you say, and adjust to what's happening. And that's, I see this a lot where people are like, okay, so I need to bluff in this spot or do this in this spot. And it's like, that isn't the answer. We need to understand what are the conditions that we're looking for and what are the things that we're looking at in order to choose which tool we're going to use today, right? Or not even today, let's not say that, in this specific hand, right? Because everything changes so quickly. One person at the table, like if Bin Wang's at the table, he changes the dynamics of the table a lot. He's a great example of somebody who's very hard to play against, and he's had very good results.
And I assure you, he is not playing GTO. He's not, and he's acutely aware of the fact that most people are too tight, and he's filling that void of aggression. That's one of the best ways to look at it, is when your opponents are too tight, there's a void at the table. There's EV to be accumulated that they're leaving out there, and if you recognize that, you can take it with aggression. But in order to feel comfortable and confident being aggressive, we need to be comfortable in our decision-making and confident and get the reps in and play these spots over and over. So it's not just show up and be aggressive, because then you'll end up punting off stacks and you'll be just as unlikely to win as the player who, never takes a light spot or never steals. So it is important to emphasize, it's not blind aggression by any means.
No, and Bin's not doing that. And I think the one thing, to me, he's one of the most extreme examples of, an American reg that's really aggressive, who isn't necessarily, playing the highest stakes. But, he is very aware of other people's images, and he will adapt, and he will, I believe, make folds when it's appropriate. So I actually think that he does adjust quite well. And one thing for sure is nobody's hero folding for spin. You can't.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing that I want to tie all of these together real quick and say that they are actually all lead to one thing. So we start with their baseline player type. Someone has their general tendencies. And then this is where we think of everything as like, that's our foundation of our understanding of their approach to the game. And then the tournament stage is the next layer of this. And that will determine what player type they are in this moment. Like Chrissy alluded to before, we're looking at the present moment. So this player might be really aggressive, but now they're short stacked on the bubble. So that tournament stage dictates to them that they can't be aggressive anymore. And most people will respond to that. So this is no longer an aggressive player type. Now that's a passive player type and going to be a very tight player type. Your perceived image will also influence the expression of the player type that we're up against. Maybe someone's tends to be tight, but the way that they perceive you is so crazy that now they're starting to loosen up. So we're not playing against a tight player anymore, because in this exact scenario, they're not tight. Maybe they're going to be loose passive against you because they think you're always bluffing. The same thing goes for the emotional state. That's the next layer on top of it. All of these things influence and determine what player type you're dealing with in that current moment. And that's the reason, that's something that like I'm very proud of what we did with the closer, where we really emphasize how all of these things tie together and how it's a step-by-step process. And each hand is not necessarily determined by how someone tends to play. It's a combination of these four aspects that are expressed in a player type in this current moment. Even though that might not be their general tendency, it's who they are right now. And that's what we need to respond to, the person we're in the hand against at this very moment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can't just put someone in a box and keep them there.
Yeah, and think back to the 4 stages that we discussed yesterday. There's when people first get there and they're like splashy, there's post money when they're also splashy, and then bubble and final table where they're much tighter. And so take the different characteristics of the tournament stage or the tendencies for exploiting that we talked about yesterday, and develop your own baseline strategy for each stage and against, in that field size, in that buy-in level against those type of opponents. And then you're going to come out with a much better baseline strategy than you would if you were trying to emulate a solver.
Yeah. And this is one of the main detriments of using solvers, because the solver is not capable of taking all of these things into account. And what we need to do is potentially use a solver if it's helpful for you as a means to understand where this baseline exists. But then we need to layer all of these other aspects into our decision-making process and begin to deviate in a logical way. And this doesn't mean you need to know what the solver outputs are to do this, but it means these types of variations in player types and tendencies in the tournament stage and the emotional state of your opponent are going to be a lot more significant in terms of the EV gained or lost by making adjustments or not making adjustments than hitting that perfect frequency of check raising or mixing your c-bet sizing appropriately, or all of these things will pale in comparison to the EV gained by making appropriate adjustments to these changes throughout the tournament.
Yeah, remember, not being exploitable versus making the most EV, right? That's a key difference between a solver and what we're trying to do. What I see some stuff in the chat, and I won't spend too much time, but I wanted to say, people are asking about, being a female and the dynamics that, exist being a female. And I think the perceived image, it kind of falls into that category. Is this person somebody who perceives women as being tight, as being risk averse? Or is it somebody who, maybe they date a female in poker who's very aggressive, so then they automatically think women are capable of over bluffing in certain spots. So I think trying to understand your perceived image is a really key point when you're a female at the poker table, and to see that you're going to be perceived differently by different people.
So we're going to sum it up a little bit. Chip accumulation in early stages. Again, one of the most important things you can do when you have chips going into this bubble stage, when everyone tightens up, you get to win so many chips without showdown. So what not to do? A high VPIP is voluntarily put in pots. So don't just play a lot of pots in hopes of hitting flops, because then you're going to be the passive player who everyone knows is they're in a ton of pots, and then they only bet when they hit something. And that's extremely easy to play against as well.
This is like playing bingo.
Yeah. Do not try to bluff people off good hands. One of the things that all three of us are really good at based on years of experience and studying is knowing, okay, this person check called on 10-10 deuce from the big blind. they probably have a lot of ace highs in weak hands. So this is a really, really good spot for a double barrel on the majority of turns. Knowing when to try to attack the bottom of people's range, the weakness, when they're weighted towards a hand that's likely to fold the turn, as opposed to when it comes ace 7 deuce and your opponent check calls, they probably got a lot of ace X. So maybe we don't want to fire 2 on that situation. So we want to be constantly thinking, what's our opponent's range? And whenever I'm considering a 2-barrel, I kind of think of, okay, of the range that check called the flop on this texture, which pieces would fold the turn and which pieces wouldn't? On some board textures, it's just like they probably have something too often to fire again or to fire a third bullet. And then on some board textures, like the one I mentioned, like the 10-10 deuce, where they just have a ton of ace high, king queen, king jack, stuff like that, double barreling with no equity is going to be an absolute print.
Yeah. And I think this is a common misconception with bluffing and aggression. And it's reflected in the solver, actually. Our bluffs are primarily designed to get our opponent to fold the weakest parts of their range. That is why we use blockers and unblockers to draws as our best candidates for bluffs. We don't use it because we're trying to get the really good hands to fold. We use it because the cards in our hand make it more likely that our opponent has auto folds. Like, we want our opponent, our bluffs are making all of their EV, or the majority of their EV, by getting the auto folds out of the hand, by getting that low equity, easy fold hands from our opponents out of the hand. So what that range is comprised of will be dependent on your opponent. If you're on 10-10 deuce, like Chance mentioned, and your opponent doesn't float ace high, like maybe they've showed you a tight fold in a spot like that, they're like, well, now it's going to be a lot harder to get them to fold, because we know that maybe they don't even defend with a lot of the deuces in their range in the big blind. So when it's 10-10 deuce and they check call, like, it's going to be a lot harder to bluff on the turn against this really tight opponent who's getting to the turn with too many strong hands. In other words, there aren't enough auto folds to justify a double barrel. Our bluffs are not to get good hands to fold. They're to get the marginal weaker parts of our opponent's range to fold. That's where the majority of their EV comes from.
And most people go ahead, Chrissy.
No, I was just going to say, I can't stress this point enough, because I think when people try to up the aggression, I don't want to say they're mindlessly bluffing, but this is probably one of the most common mistakes that I see, is that people are like, okay, I need to up my aggression. Now, all of a sudden, they're picking really bad bluff spots, trying to bluff people off good hands. Like, don't try to get somebody to fold top pair in the daily 500, at Orleans or whatever it is. That's just not what we're looking for. So I think it's, we're looking for all the spots that people aren't fighting for the pots. They don't have good hands. And I just wanted to stress this. It's like, if I had to tell you one game plan that I go into when I'm playing, the main event, a large World Series event that's maybe a smaller buy-in with a huge field that I'm not used to playing versus, this is something I try to really remind myself of, because it's something that even myself can fall into that trap of, is, well, trying to find reasons why it would make sense to try to get somebody to fold top pair, or, to fold a big hand. And I think that when you go in with this mindset of, I'm not going to try to bluff people off good hands, it will keep you out of a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and I wanted to throw an example of unblocking the hands that fold the turn. So let's use the 10-10 deuce example again. And if we think our opponent is very sticky versus small bet on the flop, and they're calling with like ace highs and king jack, king queen, stuff like that, then having a hand like 8-9 suited that you raised from late position or anywhere on this board texture would be a great one to double barrel, because not having an ace in your hand makes it more likely they have ace high. Not having a king or a jack in your hand makes it more likely they floated with overcards to the 2 10s. Plus, they're less likely to have 8s and 9s now. So you have equity when they do have the 3s, 4s, 5s that might call again. So that's kind of where blockers do come into effect, and like, oh, that would be an excellent spot to double barrel. But if I had a hand like ace queen or ace king on a board texture like that, well, I'm not going to try to bluff someone off 4s when I could just easily still have the best hand. And it's less likely they have the ace high. It's more likely they have me beat, like stuff like that.
Yeah, another example that I think is really easy to conceptualize is on the flush draw boards. Generally, when a flush draw bricks out, we are going to want to bluff without any of that suit in our hand. It's much better to have none of, like, let's say flop is 2 diamonds and the river bricks out, or the turn and river brick out. Well, if we have diamonds in our hand, we're actually making it less likely that our opponent has auto folds. And that's why if you look at a solver, it will very rarely bluff the front door flush draw combos in like a triple barrel scenario, because the cards in our hand make it more likely that our opponent has a hand that will call down rather than a hand that will be an auto fold on the river. So therefore there are better options of bluff candidates.
Yeah, definitely.
And real quick, I saw this from Jesse, who, first of all, I want to say, Jesse, making great strides in his game. I love to see the work that he puts in, saying stereotypes are dangerous. And I want to touch on this real quick because I think that it's true and also incredibly false at the same time. Stereotypes are going to be a great place to begin from. You sit down and you see, a 75-year-old man in a golf shirt, looks like he's fresh off the course. He's just there to have fun, whatever. Usually going to be a type player. We can operate under that assumption at first. And that's going to be our highest EV decision, is to assume that he's tight. And this is because stereotypically that type of player plays in that certain manner. However, we need to hold these stereotypes very loosely. We need to be very quick to adjust. If we see this old man that we think is going to be tight, all of a sudden he, is 3-betting a couple times and check raising flops and all this, are like, okay, well, that's not the average old man avatar. This is now a different player that we're playing against, and we need to make that adjustment very rapidly. So what we're trying to do with our stereotypes is extrapolate small pieces of information into grander generalizations of our opponent's play type or play style. And the reason that these are so valuable, but also so dangerous, is because if you don't change your perception of a player based on their actions and you stick to this stereotypical perception of them, you're going to lose a lot of EV. But if you completely ignore stereotypes as well, you're also going to lose a lot of EV, because generally they are accurate, but we need to still be willing to personalize it to this individual.
Strong convictions held loosely, some idiot said yesterday.
Yes.
Exactly. This is a perfect example of that. It's like, all right, I'm going to start with this assumption, but then once there's evidence to the contrary, I'm not attached to that perception. I'm not attached to this stereotype. It might be true most of the time, but it's not in this moment, so I need to adjust.
Yeah, and I think not all stereotypes are created equally. So I think the old man one, or the old person one, is a significantly more reliable stereotype than it's funny that Chrissy mentioned some stuff about females earlier. I hold a stereotype playing against females that I think they underbluff and they call a lot. But that's a stereotype that I hold loosely. But an old man's really going to have to prove it to me before I decide that he's not tight. Yeah. A girl I'm playing with, I see once or twice, and I'm like, okay, maybe this one's not as true. So, not all stereotypes are created equal, and just be aware of that. But it is a good starting point. There's a reason it's a stereotype in poker.
So what not to do?
What to do?
Oh, what to do. Sorry, I thought we were there. Yes.
Adjust VPIP based on table dynamics. And we cannot stress this enough. Like, the reason that my baseline strategy on day one of a large field MTT is to play a lot of hands and be aggressive on the flop and turn is because that's my stereotype for how people play. That's my exploit for how people play in those early stages to play against them. But if I have opponents who are just like calling down and calling every 3-bet, I need to quickly adjust my strategy based upon the table dynamics.
Yeah, I think this is absolutely essential it goes back to that being water. We're going to want to come in with our baseline strategy, but be very willing to abandon it quickly once we see that it's no longer the optimal approach.
Yeah.
The same thing as looking for these optimal bluffing spots. And that doesn't mean, check raise jamming the river. It means stealing pre-flop. It means c-betting with nothing on the flop. It means double barreling the turn when their flop, call range is too weak, or that it has a lot of folds on the turn. And focus on making these plus EV decisions and oftentimes that's going to be rooted in aggression, but other times it won't be. And that's why it's making plus EV decisions, not constantly being aggressive.
Not mindless aggression.
Yeah.
It's smart aggression that if you really wanted to plug a hand in a solver, you would see that the solver would agree with you. It's just that we're taking advantage of these spots where people are overfolding.
Yeah, for sure.
Or lacking aggression.
And just trying to make plus EV decisions. And we didn't really touch on that on the last slide, so I'm just going to glance at it. Knowingly making minus EV decisions.
Yeah.
Like, I see a lot of people make decisions where they're like, this is probably a bad call, but I'm going to do it. When in reality, we want to be looking at saying, okay, there's 100 out there and they bet 50. And I'm using these numbers because they're easier for the math. It's not a very realistic tournament scenario. I'm getting 3-1 on my call. I have to be right 25% of the time. I think they're probably bluffing here half the time. This is a very clear call, right? So attaching logic to our decisions to ensure that we believe we're making plus EV decisions. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty of times in tournaments I make a big mistake and it ends up being minus EV. But when I'm playing my best, I'm trying to make plus EV decisions. And when I'm not playing my best, there's times where I'm like, let's call this 3-bet, even though we're not deep enough to justify it. So there's plenty of times where I do the what not to do's as well. And that's kind of the killer mindset that we spoke about on day one, is finding the strengths in your game and the weaknesses, the mental mistakes that you make, so you can try to plug those leaks.
Yeah.
Definitely.
The calling 3-bets is a great example. I think we're all a little guilty of that sometimes.
Yeah. And Alex mentioned like being honest about our skill edge, right? Because there's times where I'll call 3-bets and I'll be like, well, this person's like really bad. Like I can just outplay them. But it's like, okay, wait, they have a really good hand. Like their range is strong and I'm just going to outplay this strong range at shallow stacks? Probably not.
Yeah, exactly. I think the key that you just mentioned there is shallow stacks. I think these are all parts of the equation. When we're playing on a super deep stacks, well, now our ability to outmaneuver post flop is going to be more significant in terms of our decision-making process of when to call and when to fold. Whereas when we're shallower stacks, we need to be a little more equity driven and we need that raw equity. If our opponent is only 3-betting aces and kings pre-flop and we're 30 big blinds effective, well, we still can't call 7-6 suited profitably. Even though, they might make a bunch of mistakes post-flop. We might always stack them when we get there, but that's just not going to happen frequently enough to offset the amount of times that we just have to check fold the flop or flop middle pair and check call and then fold the turn. So being honest with the value of your edge is equally important to being able to accurately assess it.
ICM simplified. And I've said this before, that ICM is incredibly overcomplicated. And in my opinion, a lot of people really think of it as, if they haven't studied this exact situation with these exact stack sizes, then they aren't really going to be able to execute the proper ICM strategy. They think that it's just this massive memorization stage, I guess you could say. But in reality, that's not the case, or at least that's not at all how I think about it. So first, what is ICM? Why don't you just explain the mathematical model, Foxen?
Yeah, so the idea behind ICM, for those who don't know, is basically that we are recognizing that chips and dollars do not have a linear correlation. In other words, every chip that you make has a diminishing value relative to its dollar amount. So if you have 100 big blinds, making one big blind is not increasing the EV of your stack by 1%. It's probably increasing it by maybe 0.5% at certain stages of the tournament, or even less. The same thing, oftentimes what people focus on in ICM is the inverse of that, whereas your stack, say you have 10 big blinds, losing 2 big blinds is more costly than the upside of winning 2 big blinds. So we have this skewed risk reward situation where we need to be focused on preserving our tournament life in exchange for some EV in terms of chips, because the chips don't have a linear relationship with the dollar value of the tournament. So
because sometimes you can fold and people can bust and you make money.
Yeah, because other people busting makes you money. And that's really the simplest way to put it, is if you fold and someone else busts and you make money, well, then there's incentive for you to fold that. And we're not talking about this threshold of EV. This is where the idea of risk premium comes into play, where you need to have a little, let's say, you need 40% against this all in to be profitable as a call. Well, maybe we need 45% because we're on the bubble, or maybe we need 45% because we're at a final table, or maybe we need 50%. Like sometimes the gap is really big, and understanding that there is usually going to be a gap in our risk tolerance relative to our, what we stand to gain is really the root of the whole thing. And understanding that like folding has value and risk is amplified at some of these later stages in the tournament.
The payout structure also impacts this strategy. And think about if it's like kind of a flat payout, which means like the jumps are really small and kind of consistent, then you're significantly less incentivized to try to win the event. But then think of it on the other extreme, like a satellite would be the most extreme version where like all you have to do is get there. But then the other extreme would be like a winner take all tournament. Well, you're trying to win every single chip. So it'd be way different. So the more top heavy and exponential the payout is, the more you're incentivized to try to play for first or to try to take a risk that might win. And a really simple rule of thumb for determining if the payout is top heavy is if second plus third place is close to first, that's typically a top heavy payout.
Yeah, and this is one of those examples where I really think, another one of those examples where I really think that taking a problem to its extreme is of incredible value. If we're playing in a winner take all tournament, well, we don't want to sacrifice. There's no such thing as ICM in that scenario, because in order to get any money, we need to accumulate every chip in the entire tournament. Whereas if we're playing in a satellite, whether we're the chip leader or have one big blind, once we get in the money, we all get the same amount. So therefore, our risk tolerance will be extremely low. And, you know, people can intuit that. That's very intuitive to most people. Like, yeah, in a satellite, you know, I know that bagging, you know, making it through into the money with 2 big blinds or 200 big blinds has the exact same value. Therefore, our risk tolerance is going to be a lot lower. And obviously, we're not talking about playing satellites. We're not talking about playing winner take all tournaments. So the situation that we're going to be in is going to be somewhere between those two extremes. But if we use those two extremes as anchors for our thought process, we can kind of figure out where we are within that spectrum in order to adjust our play style. Yeah, and definitely. There's one question that I wanted to address really quick is from Andy, which is
I was hoping this is the one you had. Good.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. So how do you keep being the hammer in late stages when ICM starts to play a big factor? Well, actually, in late stage ICM, as a chip leader, this being the hammer becomes even more valuable because your opponents are disincentivized to fight for chips. They're basically sacrificing EV to you in exchange for staying in the tournament.
Yeah. So, think about a chip leader on a final table. How wide can they open, right? It's
So basically, as ICM comes into play, if we are the covering stack, if we are the big stack, our ability to be the hammer is exacerbated. Whereas the inverse is true. If we sometimes need to be okay with being the nail. That's the be water part. Sometimes you are on the wrong side of the bubble. Sometimes you're 5 of 9 at a final table, and there are 3 people with under 10 big blinds, and you're just like, well, me doubling up doesn't really do that much, but if I fold for the next couple orbits and these 3 people bust, I make, 10 more buy-ins, whatever it might be.
But also knowing that the chip leader, whether it's a bubble or final table, is opening like way too wide, even more than a solver might recommend, you can still be the hammer by 3-bet bluffing or properly shoving with hands and not being afraid of going all in. Because let's just say they open the button and they're opening 85% of hands, right? Which, in some bubble stages, not necessarily final tables, there's buttons that are opening 100% guaranteed. And so if you're shoving like an ace jack from one of the blinds, your bust frequency will be extremely low. One, you have an ace and a jack, so it's less likely they have strong hands. When you get called, which is very, very infrequent, probably like 10% of the time, you still have equity. So by shoving on them, they fold 90% of the time. You win maybe 40% of the time. So you're still in the tournament 96% of the time by taking the shove. And so just knowing that will allow you to still take those stages. And also keep in mind that Foxen used the 5 of 9 at a final table example, which is really relevant because you can't really double up into the chip lead. You can't really do much. You just kind of have to wait for those players to bust. But there are times where you're like an above average stack, but there's a chip leader doing a bunch of stuff. Well, then it's okay to bubble, because if you are playing an all-in pot with like a pretty darn good hand and you're confident in the situation, it's okay if you're wrong sometimes, because the future equity of winning that all in is going to propel you to the very deep stages of the tournament. So the medium to large versus the chip leader is actually risk on compared to the medium and short stacks who are risk off, because they really kind of just have to fold into the money.
Yeah, I think that this is one of the things that's extremely important, and this is why I think solvers are very limited in terms of their ability to give good outputs on ICM situations, because it is so circumstantial. And we need to understand that the value of having the chip lead fluctuates significantly by how our opponents are playing. If all of our opponents are extremely unaware of ICM and they're just playing for chips and they're battling and punting and, well, now the upside of being the chip leader is significantly diminished, because the value of being a chip leader is taking advantage of all of the people being forced to overfold by the concepts that we just laid out in ICM. Whereas the inverse, if everyone is playing really tight and really ICM aware, well, now we actually might want to take more risk in order to give ourselves the chance to become the chip leader, because the value of being chip leader from a relative perspective is so much higher than in the first example. So all of these things will kind of be our compass, or our North Star of aggression or risk tolerance, which is like, how valuable is having the chip lead in this situation? And this is, sometimes a difficult thing. Emotions come into play here. And this is part of why, the mindset is so essential to this. Sometimes when we're 5 of 9, let me lay out this situation again. We're 5 of 9. 9th place has 5 big blinds. 8th place has 6 big blinds. 7th place has 12. And we have 25, and we're right in the middle. Well, if the chip leader has 30 big blinds, we double up and now all of a sudden we're runaway chip leader. If we're playing at a table where everyone's pretty tight and respecting ICM, well, taking that risk, maybe we bust the tournament 35% of the time when we get in, but that 65% of the time that we don't, we're a huge favorite to win. And we're going to be accumulating chips and getting into the top 3 at a really high frequency. Whereas if everyone's just playing chip EV, well, we not only do we not have as much incentive to gain that big stack because of the EV that it no longer gives us, we also recognize that every opponent at the table's bust frequency is a lot higher. So the value of folding and not busting increases. So these are all very reflexive, and it's important to recognize that.
Yeah, and I see some comments in a question that this might kind of help. I think of ICM as like a computer tool used to logically dictate everyone's bust frequency and expected finish. And so, you see a comment that says it takes 2 to ICM, and then Fausto's comment was like, I feel like many people are still making calling mistakes in these ICM spots. Yeah, I mean, if your opponents aren't playing ICM, then who cares, right? But imagine a final table where I have 8 big blinds and Alan Kessler has 9 big blinds. He's not going to bust. He's not going to shove the hands he's supposed to. So I can't pay for that play. I can't play for that pay jump. Sorry, tongue twister. I have to take spots that are a lot closer to chip EV, because otherwise he's just going to outlast me. But then the opposite of that would be true as well. If you have people with medium stacks who are just blasting and shoving on opens and doing just tons of things that they quote unquote shouldn't, then you become under more ICM pressure because you're significantly more likely to get that pay jump.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Cody pointed out here some great points that there are lots of flaws with ICM, and this is exactly what we're saying. We're basically trying to redefine ICM. I think what you're describing is like a solver output. It's assuming this equal skilled. Yes, 100%. So that's why we need to weigh what is the value of us having the chip leader. Are we comfortable putting the pressure on them? Are they going to succumb to this pressure? That's equally important.
Yes, succumb to the pressure, like the future stack equity. Like if I double up, but then someone else is still going to go crazy, the EV of me doubling up, the future stack equity of it isn't as high. But if everyone's playing really, really tight for the pay jumps, the future stack equity is significantly increased.
Yeah, and busting is very detrimental. It's basically, if you have high ICM pressure on you, it's disastrous to lose chips and not that beneficial to win chips. A satellite is the extreme. And that's where I would say the one thing about, if other people aren't playing ICM, if you're in a multi-table satellite where, yes, people are calling too wide, it still doesn't matter. If you're in a spot where, you can basically fold to get a seat, you still want to do that. There is still going to be that ICM pressure on you that exists. But
yeah. And sometimes seeing a visualization of kind of where the ICM pressure lies in a tournament is helpful. And, early there's very, very little. If it's not a rebuy, if it is a rebuy, it's basically 0. If it's not a rebuy, but then as you approach the bubble, it does start to matter. then it drops out after the bubble because such a huge percentage of the prize pool, like for a short stack, is getting in the money, and then it's just very small and incremental, so the ICM pressure drops once you're in the money. But then as you approach the final table and get to the final table, well, then the pay jumps start to be relevant again, so you're under more ICM pressure.
Yeah, and look at some of the WS. I'm sure a lot of you guys played the WSOP events this year. It was very common, especially when they increased this min cash to 2x. It actually exacerbated this whole chart to like significantly. The bubble stage ICM went way up because for two reasons. One, because the min cash was bigger, and two, because the pay jumps following the min cash were smaller. There would often be, some of the high rollers are great examples where I don't remember the exact payouts, but there was one of the 25Ks. I remember the min cash was 50K, and it was something like, maybe 30 people paid, 36 paid, 40 paid, something like that. So 40th place would be 50K, and then 13th place was like 70K.
Yeah.
And
really...
that's a spot where you need to recognize that like there is very little ICM in that window between the min cash and the final table. And then the ICM starts to amplify because these tournaments are relatively top heavy. So what that says to us is that once we get in the money, we need to be very tolerant of risk. We need to be very risk on, because for two reasons. One, because the value of staying in the tournament for the next 30 people or whatever is very insignificant. And then the value of having a big stack when we hit the bubble and that ICM pressure starts to increase is even more significant. So we have two things working against or working towards being more aggressive in these spots or being more risk tolerant. So that doesn't mean we want to take minus EV decisions, but it just means we don't want to sacrifice EV in the interest of staying in the tournament as much.
For sure. So overall, under ICM conditions, most of the time survival is more important than accumulation, because the value of the pay jumps often, not always, outweighs the standard chip EV considerations. And think of standard chip EV as if we were only playing for chips, we could rebuy at any time, like a cash game. That's what the standard chip EV consideration would be. And then the accumulation, which Alex already touched on, but losing chips is more harmful than gaining chips is beneficial. Anything to add there, guys? I think we covered this one.
No, I think just important to mention that this is all spectral in nature, in the sense that it depends on the situation how valuable survival is relative to accumulation. Like the one I just laid out, once we get in the money, accumulation becomes, it becomes closer to chip EV because accumulation has so much value relative to survival in that specific stage. Whereas when we're at the final table, it's going to start to invert.
Yeah, and I think one thing to note, since we are trying to focus a little bit on these, big WPT events and large field events with really top heavy payouts, is the idea that, getting the small pay jumps, say you're in the money, getting the small pay jumps might not be, well, from my personal standpoint, I'm not going to consider them, I'm not going to put too much weight on a small pay jump when first place is $1 million. I don't know if you agree with me, Chance, but that
I do, because the future stack equity is greater, right? When the EV, like getting a 40 big blind stack, the value goes up because it gives you the chance to exploit your opponents more to win a really, really big pot and make a hell of a run, right?
Yeah.
And so then the more top heavy it is, the less ICM pressure there is.
Exactly. So if I was just to sum it up really quickly, like dumb it down as simply as I can, I would say that, in these large field events where, 300 people are in the money or something like that, hundreds of people make the money. It's like you have all that ICM pressure that builds right before the bubble. And I think that there's reason to respect that. And then I would say the next stage of the tournaments where it really comes into consideration, or that you really need to apply these concepts, is the final table. And, maybe prior to the final table, but yeah.
I think that's going to be even more so true moving forward. So let's think about how poker operators and a tournament operator, WPT, WSOP, etc. What's best for them changes all this for all of us, right? Because Foxon mentioned how WSOP is doing 2x payouts, then super flat before it's top heavy. Well, that's going to be a common trend because it's better for the poker operator. More people make money, more people come back, more people have fun, etc. So I think that will be a common trend where the 2x min cash will be more common. It'll pay 12 to 15% of the field. So getting that min cash secured is important. And then we want to accumulate.
Exactly. Yeah.
So ICM simulations honestly are just like flat out wrong because they don't take into account these three variables. And as we've been literally droning about future game equity, table dynamics, and skill edge, this really does matter.
Yeah, and these all play into each other. Your future game equity is determined by the table dynamics and your skill edge. If you have a big skill edge, the equity of gaining chips for the future is more important. If the table dynamics dictate that non-showdown winnings will be very easy to come by, or in other words, your opponents are folding a lot, well, now your future game equity is increased. Whereas if we're at a table where everyone's really aggressive and splashy, well, our future game equity is lower from an ICM perspective. And the same thing goes for our skill edge. If our skill edge is not there, if we're at a table of players that are maybe better than us or just as good as us, well, now the equity of gaining chips for the future is diminished as well. So these all kind of work together, and it's very important to be cognizant of all of these different factors and their influence on one another. And it's not as simple as, okay, ICM, got to play tight. You know, a lot of people tend to oversimplify this and fail to take into account all of these things. And remember that if you're someone who looks at ICM simulations from like HRC or any of the other solvers that will look at, you know, or give you outputs, it's assuming zero skill edge. It's assuming no table dynamic. And it's forgetting to include, or actually, you know, incapable of including future game equity. HRC solves out to 7 hands, I believe, is the furthest it can go. There are very few situations where, you know, it's basically coming to a decision based on the understanding that in 7 hands, we will do an ICM job. That's more or less what it's trying to measure, how you would play if in 7 hands you'll do an ICM job. And this, it becomes clear that you would want to make it to that 7 hands if it was counting down like that. Like you know, so that's part of why some of these ICM outputs will be so tight, is because it's under a false assumption or operating under limited information in terms of how the game will actually play out.
So we want to have a framework for making optimal decisions under ICM. So first, self-awareness. Like if we just talked about skill edge, well, you need to have an honest self-awareness of where you lie in that spectrum. If you do have a big skill edge, well, then the future stack equity is greater and you should be a little bit more risk on. But if you are an underdog to the players at your table, being aware of that is super relevant, because then you're going to be more risk off. Maybe you get a new table the next day. A lot of good beneficial things can happen.
Yeah, and I think one aspect of this that's important to mention is that this does work both ways. So you having a skill edge does not automatically mean that you're always risk on. Sometimes it will actually mean that you're more risk off, because if you have 50 big blinds and you're making a high variant, you're taking a high variance line that potentially jeopardizes those entire 50 big blinds. Well, the payoff needs to be a little bit higher if we think our win rate is 20 big blinds per 100, because if we keep this 50 big blind stack, we're going to win chips gradually over time with low variance, specifically if low variance options are available. So sometimes we have a stack that already has a lot of future game equity, and therefore we actually have a lot of incentive to protect that by taking lower variance lines. Yeah. We need to weigh this against the potential of losing EV by taking these lower variance lines. And that's not an easy calculation to make, but understanding that there is this balancing act between these two concepts is the first step to, like, you know, implementing it appropriately.
Yeah, and like there's an extreme example, and I think someone was actually asking about it yesterday, but I had ace king suited against Rigby's aces. And the future, like my stack was worth so much because of the ability to continue to accumulate in the best structured soft 10K in the world, that I didn't take into account all of these things. I kind of got like too zoomed in, too wrapped up in the moment of like, oh, whatever, this guy's like crazy. Like, I guess I have to stack off here. But in reality, I should have played the hand a completely different way. And there is a video on YouTube to watch it. We don't want to dive in and steal too much of y'all's time from this, but that was a huge mistake because I wasn't considering this.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, again, the structure of there are a lot of things that play into these decisions. Like we mentioned skill edge. Well, some of this skill edge is actually reflected in the structure of the tournament. And that's why the main event, specifically in this hand, like that Chance mentioned against Rigby with the ace king suited, is a mistake only because of the structure of the tournament and because of the skill edge that Chance had in that scenario. If he was playing in a tournament of all top players, everyone's playing perfect, and or the structure was really fast, his ability to capture on his skill edge would be significantly diminished, or his skill edge wouldn't exist as much. So those two factors would push him to being more risk on. If he had a lower skill edge, or if the structure was too fast for him to realize his skill edge as frequently, well, now we're more tolerant to risk. Whereas if we're playing in a tournament that has, 5-hour levels or something like that, or just use the main event, which is extreme enough, the 2-hour levels, well, our ability to capitalize on future situations is extremely high. Players are weak and the structure is slow. So we might be able to cruise with 100 big blinds plus for the rest of the tournament. Like that's not an unlikely scenario. Whereas if you're at Poker Go or Triton playing a 30-minute level tournament with a bunch of the top players in the world, well, you having 80 big blinds, it doesn't guarantee you anything because nobody's giving an inch and there's not much value to be gained. And those 80 big blinds, if you don't play any pots or don't win anything in the next couple hours, those 80 big blinds are going to be 20 big blinds now. So we constantly need to be willing to take risk in that scenario. Whereas in a really soft field main event with a slow structure, we might be a lot more inclined to pass on the high variance spots or prepare for these spots by, taking lower variance options. So we don't 3-bet the ace jack suited where maybe it's a mix in theory, but now we just call it because I don't want to be playing 100 big blind pot with top pair in this field because I'm making so much easy money elsewhere.
Yeah. And that's why the self-awareness of being honest, right? Because some people, if you don't think you're just like crushing the field, even if the structure is good, then maybe you should be 3-betting certain hands and trying to just win a pre-flop or flop top pair.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So how do we exploit under ICM conditions? The two easiest are money bubbles, final table bubbles, and final tables. You're going to really notice when people start to tighten up for the money bubbles. And that's like one of the most common questions that I hear under ICM. And I think it was mentioned yesterday, not today, but it's like, when does the soft bubble start? Well, it starts whenever your table is slowing down, folding more, looking at the clock, and so it starts whenever they tell you it starts, because some tables, they're just blasting around like it's a cash game. They don't care about the money. It's not even on their radar. So yeah, there's really no soft money bubble, and it might not even occur until they say, oh, we're now hand for hand. And so money bubbles begin when the table tells you they do, by us paying attention, staying off our phone.
ICM is like a shadow. It doesn't really exist. You need to be able to see it for it to exist. And it's something that, like, a perfect example of the extreme version of this is I played the 1K mystery bounty at WSOP this year. And I remember we were near the bubble, and I am 95% sure that maybe at maximum one player at my table knew that we were like 20 off the money. And that's true for the entire room. So this means that as a short stack, your value of playing hands is so diminished because you're probably going to be in the money in a few hands. So why would you take a risk at this moment when you're just going to cash very, very soon anyway? That's why this is also fickle and reflexive, and it's important to be aware of these things. Whereas if we're playing 100K and it's 8 left and 6 paid, you can be sure that every single person in that tournament is very acutely aware of how close they are to the money and how little risk they're willing to take.
We get it, Mike. You won. Congratulations.
Oh, yeah, you played? Okay. I didn't see you in there. That's weird.
I had to key that one up. Yeah, and like the deep stages are the same too. Like you can tell when people are like standing up and looking at stacks at other tables and seeing how close it is to like a table breaking, and like you can really just start to tell. And when you have a lot of chips at those stages, you should just simply widen your opening range. Yeah. The other thing to be aware of is who else is widening their opening range and how we want to react to that. Do we want to take wider 3-bet shoves because they're opening way too wide now? Do we want to have some 3-bet bluffs if we're a middling stack? And so start to really think about, it's not just okay, the big stack's going to open more. Then what do we do? Then what happens, right? So it's always these layers of exploits.
Yeah, and one other thing to touch on in this really quick is that there's a lot of variability between how money bubbles play. If you're in a really big field, money bubbles should play a lot tighter. And a big part of this is, one, the collision factor of, if there are 100 tables in the tournament, it's a lot more likely that someone gets aces and another person gets kings somewhere in the tournament, and they're just inevitably going to bust. The other thing that's a lot more likely is players not being aware of ICM. If there's 1,000 players in the field, you can be pretty confident that a huge percentage of them are either not aware of the benefits of caching, or don't really care, or not paying much attention, or just don't know how to respond to it. So therefore they might be too loose. And in turn, your likelihood of caching goes up. Whereas deep in the tournament tends to fluctuate less. Most people, when they're at a final table, everyone's pretty aware of the idea of like, okay, if one person busts, I make another 10 buy-ins or another 20 buy-ins or whatever it is. So the deep stages tend to fluctuate less than the money bubbles do. And the money bubbles being easier to burst makes the value of having a big stack on the money bubble go down a little bit.
Yeah, so the larger the field, the shorter the bubble lasts, which means as you're approaching the money, taking like a spot where you're super risk on as a medium stack to get that big stack on the bubble diminishes in value, because the bubble's not going to last as long. You're not going to be able to get as many like free chips effectively without showdown. But if you're playing like a smaller field, maybe a slightly bigger buy-in, or you've played there before and the bubbles last a while when it pays 50 spots, then the future stack of getting a big stack on the bubble, or the future equity of getting a big stack on the bubble, is increased because the bubble's going to last longer.
Yeah.
All right, who's ready for a quiz?
Me.
You're on the final table bubble of a tournament with a medium stack. You've observed that the big stack at your table has been playing extremely aggressive, applying pressure on all the other short and medium stacks. Question: what is the optimal strategy against this player under ICM pressure? A, strengthen your preflop range and avoid marginal spots, playing a tight, aggressive strategy. B, VPIP wider from all positions with speculative hands that might flop well. C, play only premium hands and fold everything else in order to ladder up.
Type it in the chat, guys.
We need the Jeopardy music for this part. I see one square.
A square. Wow. I don't know if that's the answer.
I wonder what that is.
Yeah. All right. So we're seeing quite a few A's, which is the correct answer, but let's think of some of the other options first. So for B, V-pipping wider from all positions with speculative hands that might flop well. Well, that's going to put our medium stack in jeopardy of busting and probably bleeding us into a short stack if we don't pick up chips. So that's not going to be the answer under ICM pressure.
And the other reason why that's not the answer is that when we're playing against an opponent that's really aggressive and putting a lot of pre-flop, aggression and pressure on, well, our upside or our implied odds of playing these speculative hands is diminished. Just like when we talked about, if we're 200 big blinds deep and we're playing as a really tight opponent, we want to call the 3-bets a little bit more because our implied odds of making a hand are so great. When we flop 2-pair, when we flop a straight, when we make a flush, they're going to have an overpair and we're going to win a lot of chips. This is the opposite end of that spectrum, where our opponent is going to have nothing a huge percentage of the time. They probably will overweight our range towards strength and therefore be unlikely to show continued aggression. So our implied odds of playing these marginal hands goes down. So in other words, we have to understand that when we're calling with 6-7 suited, we don't win the pot that often. The value of playing these hands comes from winning big pots when we make big hands, not from winning the pots regularly. So if our opponent is, if we're not going to be able to win those big pots when we make those big hands, there's no incentive to play these hands, or less incentive to play these hands.
On the contrary, playing a strong range, a strengthened pre-flop range, and playing it aggressively is a good strategy, because if someone's extremely aggressive on a bubble and you 3-bet, they're just going to have the king 5 off, the ace 4 off, the queen 9 off, all of the dog shit hands that they just are forced to fold. And so when you start with a 3-bet against these ranges, it's just going to force a fold a significant portion of the time. And it's actually contrary to popular belief, where people are like, I don't want to play a 3-bet on the bubble with my ace jack suited or king jack suited because I don't want to bust. But in reality, you have a significantly higher bust frequency by calling and flopping top pair, and then you're just heroing in some spot with a medium and you're unsure, than you do if you 3-bet, win the pot there, or 3-bet and c-bet and win the pot there or lose the pot there. Because at the end of the day, that's okay. You're going to be risking, 6 big blinds to win 4.5. It's going to win a very high percentage of the time. It's going to turn a profit. The c-bet also going to turn a profit. And you're actually not that likely to bust if you 3-bet and c-bet and miss, because you don't have anything. It's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to mention, that some people are seize up a little bit too much in these ICM scenarios with the medium stack, because they're like, oh, I don't want to 3-bet in this spot because I'm afraid of busting. But one of the things that we need to do is zoom out and say, how likely does 3-betting this hand really make me to bust? If I'm 3-betting with a weak hand that I'm going to fold to a 4-bet jam, how do I bust in this hand? It's just not going to happen. I'm either going to 3-bet and I'm going to win, or I'm going to 3-bet and they're going to jam and I'm going to fold and I'm going to still be in the tournament, or I'm going to 3-bet, maybe I'll c-bet the flop. Like, sure, there is the chance that we could flop a big hand and get coolered, but that's always a risk we're going to run. But on average, we're looking at not that likely of busting by taking some of these light 3-bet spots.
Yeah.
So I think it's something that people should be willing to open up, especially against a lot of players like the three of us that see that people play way too tight in these spots, and in turn widen their opening ranges way beyond what like an ICM sim would suggest. And that's taking advantage of this lack of light 3-bets, and this fear that other people have of busting.
Yeah.
And alleviating that fear is
I think it's
value.
Really an emotional reaction. And I think that, obviously we've been speaking about this the last few hours now. It goes back to the same thing of having that confidence, also realizing let's just say, take it to an extreme, Alex, you're raising literally every single hand on the bubble, right? It's like, what do I have to fear by 3-betting you? If you have a range that is so wide and I have, ace 9 offsuit, let's just say, it's like, just because I 3-bet, as you said, it doesn't mean all the chips are going in, but I think people feel so emotional when they start entering a pot when the tournament is deep that it's easier sometimes to just fold. And this is what we really want to try to, encourage you to, be aware if you have this reaction and how can we fight that? Because I think when you start seeing like, oh, what usually happens is I 3-bet and they fold, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
then if they don't,
the instance tree, right? Where like if someone's opening nearly every hand and you 3-bet, sometimes the players behind wake up like a small percentage, but they have really tight continuing ranges.
And we fold.
So you get all the folds a very high percentage of the time, probably 80.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they call the other 20%, or sometimes they shove and you fold, no big deal. Sometimes they call and you c-bet and you win, or you lose, no big deal. And that's it. You win the pot at a super high frequency by taking the 3-bet against an aggressive player who has shitty hands.
Yeah.
And additionally, the times that you lose the pot, it doesn't increase your bust frequency that often. So if we're a few people off the money and we have 30 big blinds and we 3-bet and c-bet and they raise, or we end up giving up on the turn, well, now we're down to 20 big blinds. We're still very likely to make the money. So this aggressive approach doesn't actually increase our bust frequency that much. And that's going to kind of be the underlying concept behind all of this ICM, is ask yourself, how much does this action increase my chance of busting? Yeah. What influence does this have on my bust frequency? And a lot of the times, aggressive actions, especially against wide chip leader opens, are going to do very little to increase your bust frequency.
They might actually help you not bust more if you're picking up those pots, because even just picking up, 5 big blinds, let's just say they've been raised, it's like, that's huge. If you're sitting with 25 big blinds and you just increased your stack, pre-flop to, 30 big blinds or whatever it might be, it really does change the trajectory of your tournament.
Yeah. And I think we should definitely talk about more specifics on the stack size. When we're talking about finding these 3-bet folds as a medium stack, we're kind of talking about like the 20 to 30 big blind range. As you get a little bit too short, you can still have the 3-bets, but the sizing is going to be a little bit smaller because you're super polar, because you either have aces and kings and want to get it in, or you have a bluff. And so you can still do it when you have this 15 to 20 big blind stack size, but your 3-bet sizing is going to be smaller. Therefore, your opponent's going to have more continues pre-flop, so it gets a little bit dicier. But when you have the 25 to 30 big blind stack, they open 2.2 to you're 3-betting to 6.5 or 7, and the win frequency is actually increased a little bit.
Yeah, and I think I want to elaborate a little bit on, are we 3-betting or just jamming? Well, that's going to be entirely dependent on our hand. We're going to want to have hands that are strong enough to 3-bet and call. Like, we're going to 3-bet with aces. We're going to 3-bet with kings, because we're very happy to induce jams. Whereas when we have maybe ace queen offsuit and we have 15 big blinds, well, we don't want to 3-bet, because if we get peeled and the flop comes jack high or 10 high or 9 high, we're now in a spot where we have a relatively low equity hand, and our bust frequency at this shallow SPR becomes relatively low. So we don't want to put ourselves in that situation. So a lot of the times what we'll use is our high card unpaired hands as our 3-bet jams, like the ace king off, the ace queen off, the ace jack off, king queen off, and then use our high pair hands and our weak offsuit blocker, like the ace 5 off or even ace 4 suited. Some of these hands that are not good enough to jam all in, but are great blocker, have great blocker effects to be our 3-bet fold. So we kind of want to group our hands into 2 separate categories of 3-bets.
Yeah.
And 3-bet not all in, and then 3-bet all in. The 3-bet all in will be linear and strength weighted. There won't be any all in 3-bet bluffs, really. Like, maybe you'll have king queen suited or something like that, which is technically a bluff, quote unquote, but it's a really high equity bluff. But we'll mostly weight those all in combos to like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, maybe king queen, and then the pairs like 9s and 10s that are often in uncomfortable spots post flop, and then we're gonna 3-bet not all in with our hands that are more of like our lock hands, like aces and kings, and then balance those with some bluffs. So when we 3-bet small, we're either gonna have those aces or kings, or we're gonna have a bluff. And when we 3-bet all in, we're gonna be more just like linearly strong.
Yeah, and like the low suited aces are a pretty good bluff combo.
Yep.
Yeah.
So big field main event secrets, like we had mentioned, just how fun it is. We're going to break this up into 3 sections. Common mistakes, the stages that you'll see when you're there, and then dealing with the pressure. So the biggest mistakes that I see is basically people are too far on the spectrum of too tight or too aggressive. And it's really hard for people to find the balance between the two.
Yeah, and I think that it's also very difficult for people to fluctuate between one and the other. I think that the players that are best in these scenarios are the ones who understand when they need to be really tight and when they need to be really aggressive or should be really aggressive, and not conflating one with the other. And I think that what often happens is people get a little bit myopic in their approach to ICM, where they think, I have a lot of chips, I need to be aggressive. Well, that's not always true, as we discussed earlier, because if our table doesn't care about getting in the money, our aggression is just leaking chips. If we're playing an ICM strategy as the chip leader and everyone else is playing chip EV, we're going to get destroyed. The same thing goes in the opposite direction. If everyone's playing really tight, like let's say we're at a table, sometimes you're third in chips, but the 2 people with more chips than you are really, really tight, and they're not taking advantage of that, you know, that void that exists where everyone's overfolding. But these people, the reason everyone's overfolding should lead to these people with a lot of chips having extra EV. However, sometimes they're not taking advantage of that, and that leaves room for us as the 3rd, maybe 4th biggest stack to step in and take advantage of that void.
Yeah, I think, Alex and I have been reviewing some final tables recently, and the one thing that common mistake I'm seeing is people missing those 3-bet bluffs. I think that's the real, I guess, way to kind of make chips and counteract that aggressiveness that the chip leader gets to apply. You really got to find those 3-bet bluff spots.
And it's just like, it's really very mathematically based, you know.
Yeah.
If in theory our opponent should be opening 30% of hands in the cutoff, well, now their chip leader on the bubble, that might go up to 60%, that might go up to 70%. So what that really means, whereas when they open 30%, maybe they're calling versus 3-bet a third of the time after they open, or 40% of the time after they open, or something in that neighborhood, maybe 50% of the time. Whereas now they've expanded this 30% range, it's doubled. It's not like that extra 30% that they added doesn't have any more continues in it. Those are just, that just means that extra 30% is all folds. So the continue range still remains the same, but the fold range is expanded. So therefore your frequency of getting through just goes up by a significant margin. So seeing it from that is like, we have a normal range plus, and every single additional incremental hand that's added to that range is just a higher fold to 3-bet frequency for our opponent.
Yeah, especially because I think, you know, especially when we're talking about having like 20 big blinds, 30 big blinds, even, you know, 35 or 40, you're not seeing a lot of calling of 3-bets. It's often just a pre-flop game.
Let's also remember that we are talking about big field main event secrets.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about like under ICM.
Sure.
And so when we get to a new table in any main event or any big field tournament, identifying which players are playing too tight, which players are playing too aggressive, which players are too gambly, and which players just really don't want to bust. Like, those are kind of the categories we should be bucketing our opponents into. And then also being fluid and knowing that this is likely to change based on the stage of the tournament, but this is currently how we're going to bucket them, and then we're going to create a strategy accordingly.
Yeah, and sometimes this changes not just because this might change for emotional reasons, like we mentioned before. Yeah, sometimes somebody's overly tight, and we sit down and we 3-bet them 5, 6, 7 times, and then all of a sudden it's like they're normally tight, but they're so fed up that their emotions, they're feeling like they're bullied. It reminds them of when they were in high school and they got shoved into a locker and they're just jamming whatever it is. They open the 9/8 suited and they can't help themselves but jam on you. Well, like, being aware of when that fuse is getting shorter and shorter for your opponents is important. And they might all of a sudden fluctuate from overly tight to overly aggressive at the drop of a dime. And being mindful and attentive to these types of things is really important. And again, it's about being reactive and reflexive in these spots. And we need to be constantly adjusting our perception of the situation. When we sit down, like we discussed before, generally we're going to be going into these big field main events with the expectation that most people are playing too tight. But we might be proven wrong, and there might be a few exceptions at the table, and we need to make tailored adjustments to our strategy based on our perception and what we're seeing.
Yeah. So as we sit down and we're in the early stage of the tournament, we're going to have that default strategy. But in the middle stage, we should have a pretty good plan and feel for how people are playing. And that's going to kind of circle back to like regging on time, getting your exploits ready. And then by the end game and seeing how their game style changes, we might be playing a completely different style by then. So you want to think in stages, you want to have a plan, and, you know, you kind of go in with like a good default baseline and play solid. But then once you realize who you want to play pots with, who's overfolding the big blind, who's not defending the button that much, that's when we can really start to have a higher VPIP and really start to expand our ranges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thinking in stages and having plans for different scenarios is really important. When I sit down at a Seminole Hard Rock main event, I know that the whole table generally is going to be really gambly early stages of day one, especially day 1A. So maybe I won't bluff them as often. Maybe I'll be more linear with my 3-bets and less polar, and just want to be playing pots in position. Maybe I'll call more often with some of the hands that I would normally 3-bet because they're not folding to the 3-bets, and I don't want to inflate a pot with some of these marginal hands. And just making these adjustments that have a logically consistent response to what our opponents are actually doing in that moment. And the early stages are going to be one of the most, like cash game-esque elements of a tournament, where we're just kind of playing based on what there's no fear of busting. There's no risk premium. There's not as much future game equity. The equity just comes from gaining chips. So we need to be willing to do whatever we can to maximize our EV with no regard for our likelihood of busting generally.
And keep in mind that like this next slide is going to say day 2, but that might be the end of day 1 in some tournaments, right? So it's still all relative to like what stage you're at in the event. So like, first of all, the end of day 1, it is kind of about survival. If you don't have reads or maybe you late reg, it is about survival. But if it's early on day 2 in like a WPT win championship or like a main event, something like that, then you definitely want to focus on making it through in a low variance manner, dodging the landmines, not bluffing it off versus the guy that you didn't know is just never folding, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Next up, we want to identify targets. It's going to be very clear, hopefully within an hour, who's inexperienced and who really, really wants to be there. And I think this target thing that is worth mentioning, because there's players who really want to make dinner break. They want to tell their wives or partners that they made it to dinner break, that they made it through the day. So this stage can exist where there's these mini bubbles in a lot of these main event fields where the recreational players, the poker content creators, it's like plus EV for them in their mind to tell their fans or their family that they're still in the event. So identifying those targets is a major key to accumulation.
Yeah, I mean, like an example of this would be the WSOP main event, probably the best example. Mm-hmm. But I've seen a couple of times on day 1. I mean, I've seen this happen a few times with varying degrees of hands, but where it's like an hour left in day 1 and, I'm playing 40% of hands from every position basically. And there will be some guy with 75 big blinds who just goes all in over my open and then shows me aces. And he's like, yeah, he's like, I didn't want to bust with an hour left in the day. And it's like, okay, well, like he just gave me tons of information. And that might be true for a lot of people where it's like, okay, now this guy, I'm going to open his big blind every time. If he looks tentative at all, uncertain on the flop, I'm just barreling everything because this guy prioritizes making day 2 so much that he would jam 75 big blinds over an open with aces. He's probably going to overfold like crazy.
And also like now post-flop, he has no traps because he's already shown that he doesn't want to trap. So he's going to play all of his strong hands fast, which means a check calling range from the big blind would be some medium that he's already probably shown a propensity to not want to put money in with.
Yeah, so then when you can even set this up in a situation where you make it appear like you're going to put him to the test for his whole stack. And then you can know when he calls the turn, when you're setting up pot on the river, for example, that this guy actually probably isn't folding the turn because he's the type that would, or folding the river rather, because he's the type that would fold the turn with any of his marginal hands out of the fear of facing that river all in, knowing that he can't call, quote, in his mind.
Yeah. Hence the avoid third barrel lines, right? Because we talked about like finding those good 2 barrels. But also we mentioned that people are typically overfolding to the double barrel when you're aggressive. Well, if they're overfolding a little bit on the flop and then overfolding a lot on the turn, coupled with the fact they're probably too tight pre-flop, sorry, I did that out of order, the range that lands on the river after they call twice is just strong and it's super top pair heavy. And at the very beginning of today, we mentioned try not to bluff people off good hands. That's not where the value comes from.
Yeah.
So research your opponents. You make day 2 of anything. Or even now a day, like with day 1s, you can sometimes look on an iPad or the app and see who the players are. Look up the players. Like knowing their tournament history, their average buy-in, just knowing like what type of event this is for them. Are they just like, okay, well they play 10Ks and 25Ks, so they're probably don't really care about this 5K that much, or they're going to be extremely comfortable, versus this player plays $300 buy-ins and this is a 1600, like they're going to be a little tentative. They're going to probably have good hands when they bet big.
And they probably want a satellite and they probably don't have a second bullet to fire. So this type of opponent, all of a sudden ICM exists. You're playing in an ICM environment on hand 1 of day 1 against this player because he's playing a freeze out and it's his big spot. So he's going to tend to be the ultimate nail of like, I'm going to wait for a really good hand. And that's the guy who's going to bag 60% of a starting stack, like every time.
Yeah. So ask around is actually really important. Like being in a community or like Sometimes I'll text our inner circle community, or I'll text the Foxens or some group chats, and I'll be like, who is this person? Like, they look like they'd be really good. It's early on. I really don't know. But like having a little bit of information going in can be extremely helpful, because if you know that they lean aggressive or lean tight, all of a sudden you don't have to use those stereotypes. You actually have a much stronger baseline of how they're going to play. Therefore, you can make deviations right away. So I can't stress enough the importance of finding a community that you trust and believe in, because it can exponentially help your value in any main events or any tournaments that you play, just getting that extra information.
Yeah, and moving to step 3 of visualizing the table is also very important. One great example of this is when you have a really good, tough player at your table. Maybe he's to your left, maybe a couple seats over. Well, one of your most profitable open spots is going to be when this player is in the small blind, because that's going to be their lowest VPIP out of any other spot at the table. So we can take advantage. That will be, in turn, since we're recognizing, okay, my skill edge is high against every other player at the table, maybe it's a bit lower against this one. So therefore, I want to attack spots where this specific player has their lowest likelihood of being in the pot against me. And that's one of the examples of visualizing the table and just having this feel for this and this constant awareness of, okay, where's everyone at? Where is this? What is this player's like current mood? How are they going to keep playing tight like they have been all day? Did they just have dinner break and they're full and tired and don't mind busting? All of these things are going to constantly be fluctuating. So keeping that consistent visualization of the table that is subject to change constantly is going to be really valuable. And again, this ties back to not being on your phone, paying attention, watching the hands you're not in, because they will give you an incredible amount of insight to where everyone's current psychological state is.
Yeah, and I think so many times people gather this information, but they don't actually put action to it, or they don't know what to do with it. So that's like the other part of this is, yes, understand, as you profile these players, what is our game plan given this knowledge? So make sure you actually put this into action.
And one of the best ways to put it into action is being extremely conscious of who the button and the big blind is. Because when you enter a pot, those are the two players that you're most commonly going to be in the pot with, because their VPIP, the percentage of the time they played a hand, is the highest from the button and the big blind. Yeah. So if Alex is on the button and Chrissy's in the big blind, you should probably open a little bit tighter, because you're going to be faced with a lot of shit, frankly. But if it's, people who have proven to be tight or stereotypically are tight, then maybe that's like a really good steal spot. So just being conscious of, where do I want to have my widest opening range from relative to what like a baseline strategy might be.
Yeah.
And I just want to add that it's not even just necessarily when players are tight. It's also when players are bad. If you have a really weak player in the big blind, they might be a super spaz. But that still means we want to expand our opening range against them, because we recognize that our EV of going post flop against this opponent is extremely high, even with some of our more marginal hands. So it's important to not just say, oh, is this guy tight, or that guy's crazy, so I don't want to open his big blind wide. Sometimes if this guy is crazy, opening his big blind is even more profitable, because you might just make two pair and get 150 big blinds in against his top pair.
Yeah. If the person is crazy, but they're like the try to hit type, where they make top pair and they're just holding on for dear life, and if they don't make it something, then they just fold the flop. Well, that can be a great big blind to pick on, like Alex said, because you can just see bet and shut down with your bad hands, because now they have something and they're probably going to hold on. And then when you have a good hand, you're going to make way too many chips.
Yeah. One question that I always ask myself in the spot where perhaps I'm not sure what my game plan is at a specific table, or maybe I'm bored, is where's the EV coming from? And that's, another question, like, where's the EV coming from? Who's the weakest player at this table? Where, who am I going to make the most money from? And if they're in the big blind, there's, I'm probably looking for an excuse to play pots with them.
And there's levels to that shit. I just wanted to use that quote. But if someone's attacking and raising the big blind of a weak player or a fish repeatedly, well, your hand might want to 3-bet to get everyone out, because this player now has a wide range. Your hand might want to flat to keep the big blind in. It kind of just depends what type of combo you have. Like small pocket pairs or suited connectors, I'd be way more inclined to call, because the implied odds shoot way up. The odds you get paid if you make a big hand. But then if you have like the ace 5 suiteds and the ace jack offs, well, I might be way more inclined to 3-bet, because it doesn't play as well multi-way.
Yeah.
And I want to address this question really quick. How do you convert this day 1, 2, 3 concept to a single day MTT? And it's important to just kind of like, the way I like to see it is the stages of like, there's pre-reg, and then there's post-reg, and then there's pre-bubble, bubble, post-bubble. So it's not, we can, like, you know, when we say day 1, we're usually talking about end of reg. That's usually for a lot of these big field main events, registration closes at the end of day 1 or somewhere near the end of day 1. So when you're playing in a single day event, well, now the things that we discussed for the end of day 1 or the beginning of day 2 will be right around when registration closes in that event. And then everything else will just be a result of what percentage of the field remains.
So middle stages, which we're going to say day 3, but it's not always day 3, right? It could easily be when people start tightening it up, that pre-bubble stage. So it could be 6 p.m. on a one-day tournament. It could be the middle or beginning of day 2 on a 4-day tournament. So it doesn't have to be the day. It's about when certain things start to happen. And so if players are starting to significantly tighten up, well, we want to increase our raise frequency because the expected value, the EV of the steal, is going to go up. And you're going to get more heads up pots versus the big blind because people aren't flatting as much. And your win frequency for the hand is going to go up significantly.
Yep. And again, just emphasize that the day 3 is just like a general heuristic for like big field main events, or kind of like WSOP main event, because day 3 for a lot of tournaments is late stage now. So so emphasis on the middle stage, not the day 3 part. That's kind of more of an example of when this might occur, but this could occur at a different stage if it's a different structured tournament.
And notice, like for bubble, increased aggression. If opponents aren't calling as many continuation bets, increase your c-bet frequency. And all of these really are if-then, which is the same concept as the exploits from day 1 of this bootcamp, where if a player is doing X, then we respond with Y. So the exact same concept applies on an overarching strategy of how you want to play your range. I want to play tighter, I want to play looser, depending on if my opponents are playing a certain way. Just like if someone's c-betting too much or opening too much, then we want to do the next thing. So when you think of exploiting, you can exploit the stage a certain way someone plays if they c-bet too much or 3-bet way too much. You can exploit every minute detail and every overarching detail as well.
And it's important to remember that these aren't always linear, like these aren't always appropriate. All of your opponents' reactions to the different scenarios are subject to their own biases, their own emotional states. So some people don't value caching that much, and they might be relatively tight players, but maybe when it gets to this stage of the tournament, they're tired or whatever, and their adjustment to the circumstance is not as extreme as it should be. So they might end up being the exact same player throughout. So it's all about what they are actually doing, not what they should be doing.
Yep. So money bubble and stack preservation. Ideally, we're in a chip position where you get to dominate the bubble. And keep in mind that it's not just chip position. You could be 2nd or 3rd at your table, or even 4th or 5th. If the big stacks are just playing extremely tight because they want to get into the money, then you still get to be the one that dominates the bubble.
Yeah, and another example of this might be where the big stacks they know they raise a lot, but they're not really sure what to do from there. They're really uncomfortable facing 3-bets. They don't 4-bet jam light hands ever. Well, now we can actually kind of flip that on them and take their inexperience in the following node of responding to aggression. So they know they can raise more, but maybe they don't know how to respond to aggression. So,
or even if you just flat.
Or maybe they don't know what to do with their bad hands when they're out of position with nothing on the flop, which like is an uncomfortable situation for most people. So recognizing where the leaks in your opponent's approach to the bubble can have a lot of value in these spots, and it can enable you to kind of take advantage of the bubble from every different stack depth. Sometimes the way you take advantage of the bubble is just by folding. Like, that's okay. But then other times, the way you take advantage of it is 3-betting the big stack, or maybe the big stack isn't opening a lot, so you get to open even more. Maybe he'll never 3-bet you light. So who cares if he covers you on your left? He's still going to be 3-betting 8% of hands. Like, if that's the case, well, we get to open more and play as the effective chip leader.
Quiz number 2. WPT win championship, the middle of day 3. The table's quite soft except for one aggressive player 2 seats to our left. We're close to the money. We raise 50 big blinds effective with ace-queen suited from middle position. The aggressive player in the cutoff 3-bets off 60 big blinds from 2 to 6. Folds back to us. What is the optimal decision? A, call. B, fold. C, shove. D, 4-bet to 13.5 big blinds.
Excited what people say here.
Yeah, I can see this one going a lot of directions.
Yeah. Come on, guys, get your answers in there. All right, we got some D's, some...
I see mostly A and D so far.
Yeah, A and D.
I thought there was a Y, but that was someone's name.
Someone said either C or D. A. All right, we got a little bit of a mixed bag, but mostly A's or D's. Some answers are still coming.
Okay. Why don't you take the lead here, Chrissy? What are your thoughts?
Sure. Well, let's start with eliminating some. So I think, C seems like an obvious one that's just not an option. It doesn't really make sense. We only get called by, queens, kings, aces. We get called by really, really good hands when we do get called, and that's just a lot of risk to take, to pick up, less than 10 big blinds or whatever it is. So I think shove just doesn't make sense. I also think fold doesn't make sense because it's just way too strong of a hand. And, we're quite deep, to call 4 big blinds, let's say, if we see that as an option, it's still a small portion of our stack. There's some post-flop playability. Also, ace-queen suited plays pretty well post-flop. So this is kind of leading me towards call, as you can see. I think 4-bet is kind of tricky because we're taking a hand that plays so well post-flop, and now I assume if we 4-bet and he jams, we have to fold. And again, we don't want to get 50 big blinds in pre-flop with ace-queen suited, even though it is a good hand. So to me, it just seems like a hand that's going to play quite well post-flop. I think A is the effective clear answer here for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the key factors here is table is quite soft. So I wouldn't want to take the shove risk because the table is quite soft. I'm not sure I would take it anyway, but it would sway me even more towards not doing that. Yeah. But then, like you said, I would never want to fold just because ace-queen suited is so strong against an aggressive player. Yeah. It's just too good to 4-bet fold.
I'd be more likely to 4-bet fold ace-queen off than ace-queen suited.
Having that suited gives you so much more post-flop playability. You can call 2 on low-ranking boards, and then your opponent could shut down, and you could just have the best hand with ace-high. You don't have to just play your nut flush draw too aggressively. And so all of a sudden, calling becomes really beneficial because we can win, a c-bet or a medium-sized pot, and we can still take the chip lead just by calling. We don't risk getting all in, and we're not forced to 4-bet fold such a good hand, a hand with phenomenal post-flop playability.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's, a lot of people I saw a fair amount of D's, and part of the reason for this, I would imagine, is because people don't feel very comfortable playing out of position in a 3-bet pot with a hand like this, because I saw a question, are we just check folding if we miss the flop? Well, the answer is very likely no. There are not going to be that many flops that we miss so much that we are going to check fold. There are exceptions, like if the flop is Jack 9-4 rainbow with none of our suit, Well, now this is one where a lot of the hands that we dominated that were 3-bet bluffs might have improved. We don't have much visibility in terms of understanding where we are with respect to our opponent's hand on future streets. So that might be one where we're folding. But when we're calling this hand, we're having the understanding that we are toward the top of our continue range, because anything better than ace queen suited, we probably would have either 4-bet jammed or 4-bet not all in. So we need to know that the part of the reason why we're just calling with this hand is to keep in our opponent's light 3-bets that we dominate. That's an essential part of this. And the essential part of why 4-bet is not the answer here is because when we 4-bet, what we are folding out is primarily hands that we dominate.
Yeah.
The end game, where the money really starts to matter. So you definitely have to start to adapt to a tougher field. Like, one of the reasons we talk about regging on time, if you physically can continue to focus all day, is because the low-hanging fruit and the weaker players are just less likely to be in. And so players aren't going to give away chips. I kind of brought that up earlier, when people get up to 4 starting stacks and then just kind of fizzle out, because they're good at taking chips from people who are giving them away, but bad at getting chips from people who are playing good poker. So you have to begin to adapt to a tougher field. The other thing is, all of a sudden we're under a high ICM pressure. When we're deep, many players decrease their risk taking. So we respond by picking more aggressive spots against these player types. And we've touched on this quite a bit, where the chip leaders are opening too wide, or people start 3-betting way too much. And like, knowing that if I open 7s or 8s on the button and the small blind 3-bets and I have 25 big blinds, I should probably be 4-bet shoving, not folding if they're 3-betting too much, right? But if someone's not 3-betting enough, then I would probably just fold, and so there's these deviations from what the norm is that should sway our decision, and something that I would always call like a hinging factor. Like, okay, my hand can kind of do anything here. My hinging factor would be based on how my opponents are playing, based on a tendency that they may have.
Yeah, and our decisions are always going to be predicated on our opponent's responses. So this is where the danger of seeing the bifurcation between deviations and GTO play is dangerous, because they're all basically one thing. It's our approach to the game. The GTO answer is what it is because of what the opponent is doing. So we're going to create a balanced 4-bet range versus 3-bet under the assumption that our opponent is 3-betting the appropriate amount of bluffs and the appropriate distribution of value. If that's not the case, the GTO, or in this case, what we would call exploitative answer to that, would be to either 4-bet more if they're 3-betting too much, or especially with our weaker hands, or to fold more or 4-bet less if they're 3-betting too infrequently. So again, GTO is like, again, kind of like this, it's like an idealistic thing that doesn't actually exist. It's always going to be reflexive to what your opponent's doing. And since nobody is accurately nailing GTO in every single spot, there will always be a more optimal response pattern than what theory might dictate.
So as we all know, maintaining focus on multiple days, or just even one really long day of an event, can be extremely difficult. And if you're not used to it, you're not going to be able to just sit down and focus for 5 hours. Like, it is a muscle that you have to train. We talked about this a lot yesterday, but just remember that, for example, my preparation for WSOP or a tournament stop is, when I'm doing something, I want all of my mental RAM on that thing. And so I'll put my phone on Do Not Disturb when I'm with my family or in the office working, and I'll just do absolutely my best to practice optimal focus. Another thing that I like to use is nasal ring breathing. It's something that can actually give you more energy, where if, you all can do it right now, I'll do it and kind of walk us through it. Where if you breathe in through the nose, you feel this cold sensation of the air because it's typically going to be cooler than the temperature of your body. And then as you breathe out, the air is more moist, it's warmer. And so you have your focus right around the nasal ring, and you do in and out for 10 cycles. And it actually is a breathing technique that will increase your energy levels. which is something that I do because I don't like to drink caffeine too late at night because then it F's up my sleep cycle. And then I highly recommend doing something on break, movement, meditation, stretches. Like one that I really like to do is like, think of both hands, but like I do like an up and around, like a sun salutation, I think it might be called, or good morning, something like that. But do stretches that get your body moving, get your blood flowing, and it really does help you maintain focus.
Yeah, I think like that level of mobility, especially in your upper neck and shoulders, can actually have an effect on the blood flow to your brain. If your neck and shoulders are too tight, it actually will prevent your blood flow to your brain being sufficient. So this level of movement can actually help your cognitive function. And I think that like maintaining focus is a multi-pronged effect. Or a multi-pronged approach. It's we're going to be training ourselves before the tournament in terms of like staying healthy, eating well, getting good sleep. But then we also need to be prepping ourselves in the moment of doing these breathing techniques, taking stretches, doing whatever it takes to keep your focus as high as possible. And for some people, caffeine is very helpful. Nicotine might be helpful. Nootropics might be helpful. But we need to understand that almost all substances that you introduce into your body do tend to have drawbacks of some kind. So being mindful of how severe those drawbacks are for you is important in assessing the value of any of these things. But these two things mentioned here, the breathing techniques and the stretches, are something that do not come with any downsides. So yeah, I would say that if you can avoid the substances, it's better to do that.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to add that I think is really powerful, or the most powerful thing for myself, is kind of having like goal setting or positive visualization. So even visualizing myself, going back to the table, being, the player that I want to be, right? So being focused, being aggressive, and reminding myself of all of the checklists of what I'm trying to set out to do that day, right? Bag chips or whatever it might be. But just reminding myself of, the spot that I'm in, being grateful that I had this opportunity, to play this poker tournament, because I think a lot of the times you kind of get stuck in the negativity of it, which is very odd because, we all love poker, but you see a lot of people kind of get moody, I think. And just to remind yourself, we're here playing a poker tournament, having fun. And I think that that's a stronger, energetic state to play from. But I really think just having like goals for the day of how you want to show up, how you want to be, picturing the end of the tournament, just having that goal for the tournament, knowing winning is possible. So for me, I actually probably focus a lot on this kind of mental game conversation that I have in my head.
Nice. And one quick thing, I want to jump back to that ace queen suited example just for a brief second, because I was reading through some of the chat and I saw Steve and Richie talking about the ace king off and how to play this, and some people said, would you jam, would you 4-bet call? And I want to say that the answer, like someone alluded to, I guess Steven actually alluded to when he was further press, is in practice, but I'm sure we could construct examples where call might be preferred. We could construct examples where fold might be preferred. If our opponent's only 3-betting kings and aces, well, then I would just fold. I don't think that's a very likely scenario. It doesn't happen very often. And we did mention this player's aggressive, so that's extremely unlikely. The other thing is, how does my opponent respond to 4-bet? If we're playing against an opponent that has light 3-bets, or that opens light or whatever it might be, but doesn't 4-bet jam light, well, then what is the value in 4-betting ace king off? If they're never going to 5-bet jam ace 10 suited or ace 5 suited or ace 4 suited, well, then there's really not much upside in 4-betting a hand like ace king off. So therefore I'd be a lot more inclined to jam. But the thing is, I don't want us to try to walk away or look at this with the intent of finding answers to specific hands. It's recognizing the framework by which, under which we look at the spot in order to determine our answer. So if we're 4-betting ace king, why are we doing that? Well, the primary reason in this situation that we would be doing that would be to induce light 5-bet jams. So if the light 5-bet jams don't happen from this opponent, the upside of 4-betting non-all-in is pretty much non-existent.
Yeah, and I could just say that if I'm pretty deep in a main event like this, I'm likely just calling ace king off here, because I don't think people are going to be that aggressive once I do 4-bet. So I would rather...
Yeah, I would shove or call typically if I had a big skill edge, soft table, etc.
Yeah. I don't mind going post flop in a 3-bet pot with ace king where they likely don't think I have ace king. Yeah.
And how hard is it to navigate post flop with ace king off unless our opponent's some like super savage who's always going to just like put us in the blender? Well, one, that increases the upside of our hand when we flop an ace or a king, and it also makes it harder to realize all of our equity. So it's always going to be give and take. And like someone said, the answer to every question about poker should be, it depends. It depends on my opponent. It depends on how he responds to this. It depends on what he did in the prior node. So giving an catch-all answer is always going to be impossible. The only exceptions to that will be like, okay, somebody shoves 10 big blinds and we have kings. Okay. That's a call.
It's a call.
It doesn't matter. But there would still be a circumstance under which we would not call. If somehow we created a scenario where our opponent is only jamming aces, which not realistic, but if it existed, then kings would be a fold. So the answer is always, it depends, and it's always dependent on how our opponent approaches situations.
Yeah.
So before we go into dealing with pressure, I want to take a second to just mention, to make sure everyone stays tuned for the end of day 3, we have a special announcement to make. So make sure you guys attend live. We'll answer more questions and go on with that special announcement. So when we're dealing with the pressure, for me, the most important thing is injecting logic, because it allows us to not focus on our emotions. When you're sitting there in a situation, you're like, oh, what happens if they check raise? Or I really hope they don't call this bet. That is when your emotions really come to the surface and bubble over. And if you're able to focus on, okay, well, I bet this size, it has to work X percentage of the time to break even. I think my opponent's range is this. You're injecting logic instead of focusing on the emotional side of your brain.
Yeah, and then this is going to be the answer to so many. This is like a Jared. I first learned of this phrase from Jared Tendler. He wrote the book The Mental Game of Poker. I think that's a great book. I saw some people mention Elliot Rowe. He's also a great tool. He's very expensive, but all of his work is amazing. I'm a big fan of Elliot Rowe. Both Chrissy and I work with him regularly. And injecting logic into a situation is, again, it's something that we do partly out of awareness of the way that our cognitive structure works. Our brain is layered. We actually have fight or flight responses that shut off our logical brain, because in certain circumstances, like if you're being chased by a tiger in the jungle, logic doesn't really help you as much as just being in a super heightened state, ready to run through a wall or climb up a tree, even if it breaks your arm or whatever it is, do whatever it takes to survive. So that's why our brain works that way, because there are moments where our survival is predicated on our ability to like react aggressively and illogically. Potentially we maybe will be more prone to violence and more prone to irrational behavior. But then in order to reduce the emotional impact, we focus on the logical side and bring our consciousness to that logical plane rather than the emotional plane.
Building confidence also helps you deal with the pressure. It's unlikely that the very first time you make a deep run in some type of main event that you're going to be like, all right, I got this. Like, unless you have that delusional confidence that Alex spoke about before. But it's not just that. Like, I think it's believing that you're making the correct decision. So when you are injecting logic and making a bluff that you believe is the right bluff, it's easier to be confident in it. And I've actually noticed this in myself. When I make a bluff that I don't think is good and I'm just kind of emotionally pulling the trigger, my emotions rise and I'm sure I give off live tells. But then the other side of that coin is also true. When I believe it is a good spot to bluff, I don't think I give anything away. So make sure that you believe that you're making the right decision.
Yeah, and that goes back to having a reason for what you're doing. We're not just ever blindlessly, barreling off or betting, and even just any bet in general is not without any thought or logic behind it or reason.
And this is part of why building a framework of thought is so much more important than trying to memorize outputs, because your ability to memorize outputs is limited. So you will always be in a state of insecurity if you're trying to replicate or emulate a solver's outputs, because you won't be sure if what you're doing is what the solver is doing. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, he's doing this, therefore I am responding in this way because I think that his range looks like this, and therefore this will be profitable because of XYZ. That's a lot easier to have confidence in. And we can integrate the two to some extent, but having that confidence in your own framework, your own logic, your own ability to think through the spot is going to be so much more valuable than hoping that you can remember what the output says on the turn when the river, or when the, you know, the flush draw completes, or whatever the example is.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Mental framing is incredibly important. Can you guys hear the dogs?
A little bit.
Okay. They shouldn't last long.
We had lab dogs over here too.
Yeah, I'm at my mom and stepdad's. Mental framing is super important. And there's so many times you're going to get towards the end of a tournament or a big stage, maybe it's a stream table, right? And you start to feel what could be perceived as anxious energy. But for me, like, the biggest thing that I've realized is thinking of it as excitement has actually allowed me to never feel like I was anxious again.
Mm. That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. Anxiety is generally, or stress is usually the result, or I guess the definition of stress is when the available energy is insufficient relative to the energy demand. So when you have anxiety, is basically your body demanding a lot of energy and it not necessarily being available. And that's an uncomfortable feeling. So when you recognize and harness this energy as something that, okay, I can put this towards making good decisions and being in an alert state, and and then another thing for the framing is to come back to, like, one thing that I find helpful is, what is the worst thing that can happen in this moment? Mm-hmm. You're 2 tables left of a big tournament and you're like, okay, you know, the worst thing that can happen is I bust and I get 15th. Well, then what is my life like? Still pretty good. All right, let's go.
You haven't lost that much. I think that's such an important thing. I remind myself of that constantly. Like, this,
and if your life's not good, if you bust the tournament, you shouldn't be playing.
Correct. Yeah. Almost as if, like, not that this doesn't matter, because of course it matters and it would be great to win, but that it's okay if I bust. And Alex, I think both of you actually are really good at this. Just that willingness to die at any stage. And we talked about that earlier, how do you overcome that fear of, busting when you get late in the tournament? I know a lot of people have said that in the chat. And, I think that's a very natural reaction. And Alex, I think you have a quote for that, but I can't remember what it is. Something about being willing to die at any moment.
Yeah, well, in order to truly live, you have to be willing to die. And it's very, very true in the context of poker, where the person who's unwilling to die in their mind has sealed their fate already the second they hit register, because in order to have a chance at winning, you need to be willing to bust. And that's the reality of the game. And we need to be accepting of that when we go in, and accepting of that at any moment, in order to allow us to make the appropriate decision in each spot without allowing fear to overcome our decision-making process.
Yeah. And I think when you're deep in a tournament, there's so much adrenaline that it actually kind of feels like your whole life is at risk. Like it's your real life. I mean, the feeling when you bust a tournament feels like you died, right? So I think it's important to zoom out. Remember, you're going to play more poker tournaments. There's going to be more shots.
Yeah, and there's a great hand between Eric Afriat and Barney Boatman deep in the Barcelona EPT main event. I think it was last year, where Eric runs some bluff on Barney for, huge amount of the chips in play, like massive pot with 2 tables left, I think it was, and Barney makes a call with top pair. It's a good call. Eric has tournament life, and Eric just goes on for like the next 30 minutes about, wow, for your tournament life, how do you make that call? How do you make that call? It's your tournament life. And eventually Barney turns to him and is like, it's my tournament life, not my real life, buddy. If I bust, he basically said, like, yeah, if I was wrong, life goes on. I'll be okay. It's not like I'm going to get murdered, as soon as I make the call. Yeah. But the thing that poker does is it triggers this survival instinct in us a little bit sometimes. And that, like we discussed before, brings us out of a logical state and might cause us to try to survive at all costs, which might be making bad decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, experience does help with dealing the pressure. Like, just because I said that, well, I turned my anxious energy and just convinced myself I'm excited. Could I do that the very first time I thought of it? Probably not, but I'm really good at it now.
Yeah.
I'm also more comfortable with being on stream tables or final tables or deep stages, right? So it is a combination of experience and preparation. Like, if you're comfortable with the decisions that need to be made, then you're going to have more confidence. It's going to be easier to inject logic. All of this becomes easier. Everything compounds.
Yeah, all of these things are basically a muscle that you can improve over time. And this is part of why I say experience is everything. Go get the reps, play the tournaments. It doesn't matter what the stakes are, because if you are able to take the tournament without, with an agnostic approach to the stakes, you'll be able to put yourself in a similar situation over and over and over again that might come up in that spot that is a really big spot with tons of money on the line. And you can remind yourself, this is just like that other time. And whatever happens, happens. I've gone from chip leader with 9 left to 9th many times. And if you've never done that, you're not playing the chip leader effectively. And that's another thing to recognize. If you never get 15th in a tournament, never get 12th in a tournament, you're probably always going to get 9th, or always going to get 8th, or always going to get 7th. And we recognize that the value of winning is so great that we need to accept the potential of getting 12th in order to increase our chance of winning appropriately. Yeah. So like that fear of death or busting is a huge hindrance for most.
Yeah. I saw people talking about people's Hendon mobs in the chat. And if you look up Brian Altman, his Hendon mob's really crazy because it's a lot of firsts and then a lot of like 8s or 9s or something. Do you remember we looked this up? Yeah, he never finishes 4th or 5th or 6th.
Yeah, he has like 25 first places and then like 4 seconds and then like no third, like 1/3, 1/4, and then a bunch of like 10ths through 9s, because it just shows
it's not because he's destroying everyone heads up and 3-handed. It's because he either has all the chips already or he's out of the tournament.
Yeah, and maybe you could argue he takes it too far. I don't know. Probably I don't play with him that much, but I know that he's someone who's he's willing to take those spots. He's willing to go for it, and he's willing to bust. He doesn't. He's not afraid of getting 10th. He's not afraid.
And he has the craziest eyes of anyone in there.
He does. He's very feared. I will say I definitely agree with that. Sorry, Alex. You.
Well, yeah. No. As soon as he opens a hand, it's like it looks like he's about to like explode. It's crazy.
All right, so tomorrow is going to be extremely important to your guys' success, especially building these early game stacks, because early on it's all about the multi-way pots because people are gambling, right? So you're going to be in all these multi-way pots, and capitalizing while winning chips and bluffing your opponents or value betting them is a major key to success. So make sure to show up on time. Again, we have the special announcement tomorrow, and then Live Tells Secrets, one of my favorite topics, and we're actually going to get into how to develop reads as well as some of our favorites, and then battling aggressive players, because there's a lot of talk about it, right? Like, what if someone else is the hammer? Well, we do want to battle those aggressive players, and we want to figure out the best way to do so. So make sure you guys show up tomorrow, ask questions as we go through it, and make sure that you develop a good understanding. Do you guys want to take a 5-minute break and then start the VIP session?
Sounds good. For all those not in the VIP session, thanks for coming out. This is great. I love the questions that we've gotten, and I feel like this is exciting to see the enthusiasm.
No doubt.
Agreed.
All right. Bye, everyone.